Pay my mother first and I'll save your son, Annie added, steady as sunlight through glass. I mean it, sir. I can save your son. Richard Whitmore turned toward her slowly. He had been halfway down the curved staircase. His gray eyes rested on Annie with open disbelief. Near the front table, Rosa Johnson felt the blood drain from her face. The dusting cloth slipped from her fingers and landed softly on the hardwood floor. Annie, she whispered, panicked, tightening her throat. Baby, no. Annie did not look back. Richard descended the last step and stopped a few feet away from her. Do you understand what you are saying? He asked, his voice low and controlled. My son has been sick. For months, I've had specialists from Atlanta, Charleston, and New York in this house, neurologists, pediatric consultants, men and women with 30 years of training and experience. They have all failed him. Every single one. And you stand here and tell me that you can save him. His expression hardened. That is not just unlikely. It is ridiculous. Annie lifted her chin. It may sound that way, she said. But I'm telling the truth. A dry, irritated laugh came from the study doorway. Martin Kessler, the estate manager, stood there with his clipboard tucked under one arm and his usual look of polished disapproval spread across his face. Mr. Whitmore, this is exactly why I've said staff should not bring children into the main house during private family matters. Rosa stepped forward quickly. I'm sorry, sir, she said, looking at Richard. Humiliation rose hot in her cheeks. She shouldn't have spoken like this. Annie, apologize now. But Annie spoke before her mother could pull her away. My mother shouldn't have to keep waiting for money she already worked for. That changed the air. At that exact moment, Catherine Whitmore entered from the hallway near the breakfast room. She wore a pale cashmere dress and pearls, her blonde hair smooth and elegant in a way that made disorder look unwelcome in her presence. Richard, Catherine said, coming to stand beside her husband. What is going on? Her eyes moved to Rosa, then to Annie. And what is this about wages? Rosa lowered her gaze. Richard answered too slowly. Catherine noticed. Richard, it's a payroll matter, he said at last. There was a delay. A delay, Catherine repeated in paying the woman who cleans our home. Martin stepped in at once. Mrs. Whitmore, it was simply an internal accounting adjustment. Annie looked from him to Richard and said, my mama keeps working and the money keeps not coming. Annie, Rosa said sharply, but it was too late. Catherine turned fully to her husband. Then settle it today. Richard did not answer. That silence sharpened something in Catherine's face. Why are you hesitating? She asked. What happened to the money? Richard's jaw flexed. Part of the household reserve was redirected last week. For what? He gave a short, restrained breath. For Evan's treatment team, travel, additional consultations. Catherine stared at him. You used payroll money. It was temporary. Rosa looked up then, shocked despite herself. Catherine's voice dropped, but the steel in it remained. Richard, pay the woman today immediately. And as for Evan, we will find another way. Do not turn this house into a story people can whisper about at the club and after church. Fix the wages, then deal with our son privately. The foyer fell silent again. Annie looked up at Richard and spoke with the simple logic only a child could make sound like judgment. You didn't pay my mother what she already earned, but you promised reward money to anybody who could help your son. No one moved, she went on, her voice calm and clear. So if I can save him, and you pay my mother first, I still get the reward, too, right? Like you said. Catherine turned her head toward Annie, surprised. Martin nearly choked on his own disapproval. Rosa closed her eyes in fresh mortification, but Richard did not laugh. He studied the child in front of him, and for the first time there was something almost like unwilling respect in his expression. You are very certain of yourself, he said. Yes, sir. And you are saying this as a bargain. Annie shook her head. No, sir. My mama's money isn't supposed to be a bargain. That's hers already. I'm asking about the reward after that. That landed harder than anything else she had said. Catherine looked at Richard with an expression that was part disbelief, part shame on behalf of them both. Martin shifted his weight but said nothing. Richard folded his arms. Let me understand this. If I pay your mother now, you expect me also to keep my word about the reward? Yes, sir. And if you cannot help my son? Rosa stepped forward. Sir, please. But Richard lifted one hand, not taking his eyes off Annie. If I pay your mother today, he said, can you save my son? Annie did not flinch. Yes, sir. His voice lowered. Think carefully before you answer again. If I settle her wages now and you fail, then the next payment due to your mother will be delayed again until I decide otherwise. Do you understand? Rosa drew in a sharp breath. That's not fair. No, Annie said softly, still looking at Richard. It isn't. Then she added, but I can still save him. For a long moment, Richard Whitmore said nothing. At last, he turned his head slightly. Martin, call accounting. Have Rosa Johnson paid in full today. Martin blinked. Sir, today. Yes, sir. Rosa looked as if she did not know whether to thank him or resent the fact that her dignity had needed a witness to be acknowledged. Catherine let out a slow breath, though her eyes remained on her husband. Still troubled by what she had learned, Richard turned back to Annie. Now, he said, you are going to tell me why you believe you can do what all my doctors could not. Annie nodded once. He stepped aside from the staircase. Come upstairs. Rosa moved instinctively toward her daughter. Annie, no, but Annie reached for her mother's hand and squeezed it once, brief and steady. Then she let go. Richard Whitmore did not wait long after making his decision. Once Martin was sent to call payroll and Rosa stood frozen in the foyer, still trying to understand how a paycheck had become both a moral reckoning and a bargaining chip. Richard turned toward the staircase and said, "Come with me." Catherine Whitmore remained beside him for half a second, studying his face with the uneasy look of a woman who had just discovered that money had been moved quietly inside her own household and did not yet know how far the habit of secrecy went. Then she looked at Annie. "If you are going upstairs," she said, her tone measured and cool. "Then I'm coming too." Rosa instinctively stepped forward. "Sir, ma'am, I don't think this is a good idea." Annie reached for her mother's hand and squeezed it once. "It's all right, Mama." Richard had already started up the staircase. Rosa climbed behind Annie, one hand hovering close to her daughter's shoulder, as if she could still pull her back if needed. Catherine walked in silence on the other side, graceful but tight around the mouth. At the end of the long hallway, Richard stopped before a double door painted a muted blue-gray. He put one hand on the knob and stood there a moment. That hesitation did not escape Annie. Then Richard opened the door. The room was large, warm, and carefully arranged in the way expensive sorrow often was. Heavy curtains had been drawn halfway against the winter light. A tray with untouched broth and crackers sat on a side table. Shelves held framed photographs, model airplanes, leather-bound books no child had likely chosen, and one baseball glove that looked as though it had not been touched in months. The air smelled faintly of medicine, fabric softener, and the stale stillness of a room kept too quiet for too long. In the center of it all, propped against white pillows beneath a navy throw blanket, lay Evan Whitmore. He looked up when the door opened. The first thing Annie noticed was not that he looked ill. It was that he looked prepared. Prepared to be looked at, prepared to answer questions the right way, prepared to wear the pale, patient expression adults had taught him was expected of him. He was a handsome boy with fine features and dark hair falling across his forehead. But there was a strange stillness in him that did not belong to childhood. "Dad," he said softly. Richard crossed the room at once. "How are you feeling?" The answer came too fast. "Tired." Annie watched him closely. Catherine moved toward the bed and touched the blanket near Evan's knee. "Sweetheart, we've brought Annie upstairs." At that, something changed in the boy's face. Not much, just enough for Annie to catch it. The careful weakness slipped for 1 second, replaced by surprise, and then something else. "Alertness." "Annie," he repeated. She stepped forward. Rosa stayed near the door, her body taut with worry. Richard turned toward Annie. "You said downstairs that you could save my son. This is your chance to explain yourself." Annie looked at Evan first, not Richard. That was the first thing Catherine noticed. "Can I talk to him?" she asked. Richard frowned. "You're talking to him now." "No, sir," Annie said, still calm. "I mean, really talk." Catherine glanced at her husband. "Letter." Richard did not like that answer. It showed in the way his mouth tightened. Still, he stepped back a little from the bed. "Fine." Annie moved closer until she stood at Evan's bedside. "Hey," she said simply for the first time since they had entered. The corners of Evan's mouth shifted faintly. "Hey." Rosa blinked. That small change in him had happened faster than any specialist had ever managed. Annie tilted her head. "You look worse when grown folks ask how you feel." Richard stiffened. Catherine said nothing. Evan's fingers tightened on the blanket. "I am tired." Annie nodded as if she accepted the answer. "Maybe." Then she glanced around the room. "But I don't think that's the whole thing." Richard stepped forward. "That is enough." But Annie turned to him without flinching. "You asked me why I think I can help him. I'm trying to tell you." The room went silent again. Richard's face darkened, not with rage, but with the strain of a man being forced to wait in his own house. Catherine laid a hand lightly on his sleeve. "Richard," she said quietly. "Listen." Evan had gone very still. Annie looked back at him. "Do you want me to lie?" she asked. He shook his head. "Then don't you lie either." The boy's eyes dropped to the blanket from the doorway. Rosa felt her heartbeat pound in her ears. Richard spoke again more tightly now. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Annie finally turned to face him fully. "I'm saying your son knows how to look sick." That sentence landed like a hand striking wood. Rosa let out a breath. Catherine's eyes widened. Richard stared at Annie as if she had crossed some invisible line that no child, no employee, no outsider had permission to cross. But Annie did not retreat. "He talks different when you ain't in the room." She said. "He sits up quicker, too, and he listens like he's waiting to see who people want him to be." No one moved. Evan swallowed. Richard's voice dropped to something colder. "You had better be very careful." Annie held his gaze for just a second, then looked back at Evan. "I'm not trying to be mean," she said softly. "I'm trying to help." The boy's face changed then, and Rosa saw it. Not a recovery, not relief. Fear. Not the fear of being found out exactly, but the fear of a child standing too long inside a story he no longer knew how to climb out of. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that stay with you. Catherine noticed it too. She drew in a slow breath and looked at her husband. "Richard," she said. Maybe we should stop asking what doctors think for 1 minute and ask what our son is afraid of. The words seemed to hit him from somewhere deeper than Annie's had. He looked at Evan, really looked, perhaps more honestly than he had in weeks. And Evan looked away. Annie did not smile. She did not act triumphant. She only said, if I'm going to save him, y'all have to stop scaring him first. That left the room without anyone answering it. Richard Whitmore stood at the foot of his son's bed, a powerful man in a private room full of money, medicine, and silence. And for the first time, he was beginning to suspect that what lay before him was not only illness, but a truth no specialist had been paid to see. For several seconds after Annie spoke, no one in Evan Whitmore's room seemed willing to breathe too loudly. The late afternoon light had begun to thin behind the half-drawn curtains, turning the room the color of old gold and fading paper. Somewhere downstairs, a door closed softly. Farther away, even on days when nobody had the appetite to deserve the word, but in Evan's room, time held still around the boy in the bed. Richard Whitmore stood at the foot of it with both hands in his pockets, his shoulders rigid, his expression composed in the dangerous way only powerful men managed when they were close to losing control. Catherine remained beside the nightstand, one hand resting lightly against its polished edge. Rosa had not moved from the doorway. Annie alone seemed at ease, though not careless. She stood beside Evan with the calm focus of someone who had noticed what the adults had missed and did not yet understand why that was such a threatening thing. Evan kept his eyes on the blanket over his knees. Richard spoke first. Leave us. Rosa's heart lurched. Sir. He did not look at her. Not all of you. Martin can keep payroll moving downstairs, but Rosa, Catherine, Annie, you may stay. He paused, then added with effort. The rest of the household is to stay out of this room. It was the kind of order that usually restored shape to a bad moment, but this time it did not. This time, the trouble remained in the room with them, looking like a boy no older than 10, lying too still beneath the navy throw. Richard stepped closer to the bed. Evan, he said, his voice lower now. Look at me. The boy obeyed, but slowly. His face had gone pale in a different way than before. Not sickly, cornered. Did you hear what Annie said? Richard asked. Evan nodded once, and the child opened his mouth, then closed it again. Catherine leaned in slightly. Sweetheart, no one is angry with you. That was not entirely true. Or perhaps it was too early to know if it was true. But it was a mother's sentence and it softened the room by a degree. Annie looked at Evan and said, you don't got to answer fast. Richard's eyes shifted to her, but he did not interrupt. Evan swallowed. I didn't ask her to say anything. I know, Annie said. The boy looked down again, fingers knotting in the blanket. He had the kind of careful manners wealth often mistook for character. He said please to house staff and thank you to nurses. He knew not to interrupt adults and how to smile politely through discomfort. But Annie, sitting close enough to see his eyes, understood something the others were still circling around. Manners were not the same as peace. Richard dragged a hand across his jaw. We are going to be honest in this room, he said. Do you understand me? Evan nodded again, though his mouth trembled after. Richard continued more tightly than before. Are you pretending to be sicker than you are? The question landed too hard. Rosa winced. Catherine closed her eyes for 1 second, almost imperceptibly, as if she wished she could take the words back before they touched the child. Annie was the only one who did not seem surprised. She had known, perhaps from the start, that grown people preferred to force truth out of children with the blunt edge of authority and then act wounded when the child recoiled. Evan's chin dipped lower. I don't know. Richard's patience thinned visibly. You do know, Richard, Catherine said quietly. Not like that. He turned toward her with something raw in his face. Then how? Tell me how, Catherine. Because I have spent months trying every other way. No one answered him. That silence told on the whole house. It told on the doctors who came and went with their expensive cases. On the staff who had learned never to say what they noticed. On the routines built around Evan's weakness until weakness itself had become furniture in the room. It told on Richard, too. Perhaps most of all, Annie reached over and touched the baseball glove resting on the shelf beside the bed. It was brown leather broken in just enough to prove it had once mattered. You used to play, she asked Evan. The boy looked at the glove as if he had forgotten it was there. With Dad. He said softly, when he took a moment last spring before the word entered the room and stayed there. Annie turned to him. Do you miss it? He nodded. Do you miss school, too? That did it. Not in a dramatic way. Evan did not burst into tears or throw off the blanket or confess all at once like children did in television movies written by adults who did not remember what fear felt like in a small body. What happened instead was quieter. And because it was quieter, it was truer. His breathing changed. His shoulders drew inward. His eyes filled, not quickly, but with the helpless resistance of someone who had spent a long time trying not to let a secret become visible from the outside. Annie's voice softened. Something happened there. Richard looked sharply at his son. Catherine whispered, Evan. The boy shook his head once hard as though denial itself might rescue him. No. Annie did not argue. Okay. Evan looked at her surprised. She shrugged a little. Okay, if you don't want to say it yet, but it still happened. The grace of that answer did something none of the adults' urgency had done. It gave him room. Rosa saw it at once. She had seen it before in hospital waiting rooms and church basement and school offices. People spoke more truth when they were not being cornered by the need to speak it perfectly. Richard sat down in the chair beside the bed, a movement so sudden and uncalculated it startled even him. Usually he remained standing in this room, looming at the edge of illness with flowers, specialists, and instructions. Sitting made him look less like a man addressing a problem and more like a father who no longer knew what to do. "When did this start?" he asked, and though his tone was still controlled, the steel had faded out of it. Evan's fingers twisted deeper into the blanket. "I was tired." Catherine brushed her hand over the boy's hair. "We know that, sweetheart. But tired from what?" No answer. Annie glanced around the room. Her eyes landed on the books by the bed, the untouched broth, the stack of homework folders on the desk in the corner. One of them had bent edges and a school crest stamped in gold across the front. Whitmore Academy Lower School Prestige in dark blue paperboard. She tilted her head. "Do you get sick more on school mornings?" Rosa closed her eyes briefly. There it was. Not magic. Not medicine pattern. Evan's face changed again. Only slightly, but enough. Richard noticed that was the first real break in him. It happened so quickly that if Annie had not been watching closely, she might have missed it. His shoulders lowered by half an inch. His mouth opened and shut. The certainty that had carried him through business takeovers, courtrooms, boardrooms, and negotiations did not help him here. Because if Annie was right, then all the money and effort of the past months had been organized around the wrong question. "Evan," he said now very quiet, "has school made this worse?" The boy's lips trembled. Catherine crouched beside the bed so she could look up at him rather than down. The gesture changed the room again. "Honey," she said, "if someone has hurt you or frightened you or made you dread going there, you have to tell us." He did not look at either of them. He looked at Annie. That more than anything wounded Richard. It was plain in his face. The child in the bed trusted the daughter of the housekeeper more in this moment than the parents who had built a life around protecting him. There were reasons for that perhaps, but reasons did not lessen pain. Annie did not take advantage of the trust. She only said, "You can say it little. You don't got to say it all at once." Evan let out one shaky breath. No one moved. "They what?" Catherine asked gently. His eyes filled at last, and he blinked fast, ashamed of the tears before they even fell. "They mess with me." Richard's head lifted. "Who?" "At school." The room seemed to contract around those two words. Catherine looked as if she had been struck. Rosa pressed one hand flat against the door frame. Annie remained still, but inside herself, she felt the quiet click of something falling into place. Richard stood up again too quickly. "Who?" Evan flinched. "Richard," Catherine warned, but Richard was beyond gentleness for that one moment. Not rage. Not yet. Worse, a father's outraged confusion. "Who has been bothering you?" Evan wiped hard at his face with the heel of his hand. "Some boys." "What boys?" He shook his head. Whether from fear or exhaustion, none of them could tell. Annie spoke before Richard could press harder. "He ain't ready for the names." Richard looked at her, breathing hard through his nose. "And you know that, too." "Yes, sir." That "yes, sir" did not sound submissive. It sounded factual. Richard hated it and needed it at the same time. Catherine rose slowly from her crouch. "Let's not force this all in 1 minute," she said. "We know more than we knew an hour ago. That matters." Richard turned away from the bed and walked 2 steps toward the window, then stopped there with his back to the room. Outside, beyond the curtains, the last of the afternoon light had begun fading over the bare grounds in the long drive. When he spoke again, his voice was low and roughened in a way none of them had heard before. "Did you believe you had to stay sick not to go back?" he asked. Evan did not answer right away. Then so softly that Rosa almost missed it. The boy said, "If I'm sick, nobody makes me go." The room fell into a silence so full it nearly had shape. Annie looked down at her hands. Catherine bowed her head. Rosa thought of all the ways children suffered in plain sight. While adults measured symptoms and called it attention, Richard stood unmoving at the window. And for the first time since Annie had spoken. In the foyer, it was not disbelief on his face. It was guilt, cold and clarifying. When he finally turned back, he looked older than he had 20 minutes before. Annie met his eyes. She did not smile. She did not say, "I told you so." She only spoke the truth the next step required. "He doesn't need more doctors first." She said he needs somebody to help him not be scared. And in the hush of that expensive room where pain had worn the mask of illness until a child called it by its proper name, everyone understood that whatever came next would not be about medicine at all. It would be about finding out what kind of fear could make a boy choose a sick bed over a classroom and what kind of father had been too desperate to notice. Richard Whitmore did not speak for a long time after Evan said it. "If I'm sick, nobody makes me go." The words stayed in the room like smoke after a fire, thin but impossible to ignore. The late afternoon light had faded further now, leaving the edges of Evan's bedroom in a soft winter dimness. The white pillows, the untouched tray, the baseball glove on the shelf, everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago. And yet, nothing in that room felt the same anymore. Catherine was the first to move. She reached for the lamp beside the bed and turned it on, as if light itself might help everyone face what had just been spoken aloud. A warm amber glow spread across Evan's blanket and the side of his face, making him look younger than he had a moment before. Not sick, not difficult, just young. Young enough to still believe that fear could trap you if you named it too fast. Rosa stayed near the doorway, quiet and watchful. In another house, in another life. She might have stepped back and let the family have their privacy, but privacy was often the luxury people turned to after truth arrived. And she knew enough about pain to know that some truths disappeared if the wrong silence followed them. Annie stood beside the bed, her hands folded in front of her now, no longer pressing, no longer asking. She had done what she came to do in that moment. She had opened the door. What the grown-ups did next would matter more than anything, she said. Richard finally turned from the window. His face had gone still in a new way, not with business control, but with the strained attention of a man forced to hear his own failure in a child's voice. Why didn't you tell us? He asked. Evan lowered his eyes. Catherine answered before the boy had to. Maybe because he didn't think we were listening to the right things. Richard looked at her sharply, but there was no energy in him to argue. What she had said was too near the truth. He crossed the room again, more slowly this time, and sat in the chair beside the bed. It was the first truly ordinary thing he had done since Annie opened her mouth in the foyer downstairs. No commands, no threats, no reaching for authority like a crutch. He simply sat down. Evan, he said, and his voice was quieter now than Rosa had ever heard it. I need you to help me understand this. The boy's fingers moved restlessly over the blanket. I tried. Richard frowned. When? Evan blinked, and for a second, the answer seemed to embarrass him more than the tears had. I said, my stomach hurt on Sundays, he murmured. And in the car, Catherine's hand went slowly to her mouth. Richard stared. That doesn't tell me someone's hurting you. It did to me. That landed harder than anything else. Rosa looked down for a moment. She had heard that kind of sentence before years ago in hospital waiting rooms and school offices from children who had given the warning in the only language they had. Belia, headaches, nightmares, sudden fevers before morning drop-off. Adults often called it nerves, moods, phases. Children called it surviving. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed now, one careful hand on Evan's shin through the blanket. Sweetheart, she said, what are they doing to you? He swallowed, mostly talking. Richard's eyes narrowed. Talking how? Evan hesitated. They call me names. What names? The silence that followed was not empty. It was choosing. Choosing between shame and relief. Between saying a thing out loud and letting it stay inside long enough to become part of you. Finally, Evan said, weak, spoiled. Crybaby. He paused, then added with visible effort. One of them calls me Princess Boy because I don't like football. Catherine shut her eyes. Richard's expression changed in a way Annie had not yet seen from him. Not anger exactly. Anger was simple. This was something older and colder. The kind of feeling that began in helplessness and then started looking for a direction. Who? He asked again. Evan shook his head quickly. I don't want you to make it worse. Annie spoke softly, not to interrupt, but to steady the room. That means it's been bad for a while. Richard looked at her. This time, there was no irritation in it. Only the reluctant acknowledgement that she was still the only person in the room hearing things in their proper order. Catherine smoothed her son's hair back from his forehead. Did a teacher know? Evan gave a tiny shrug. Mrs. Dobbins told us to be kind. That's not the same thing, Annie said. No one corrected her because no one could. Richard stood up abruptly and walked 2 steps away, then stopped. The effort it took him not to explode was visible. Men like him were trained by wealth and positioned to solve problems with speed. Make the call, fire the person, buy the expert, shut the damage down. But this was not a problem made of contracts or payrolls or public statements. It was a child sitting under a blanket, ashamed of pain he had tried to convert into illness because illness was the only excuse adults honored immediately. Catherine rose too. Richard, he looked at her. We cannot storm into that school tonight and terrify him more, she said. He gave a hard exhale. You expect me to do nothing? No, I expect you to be his father before you become Richard Whitmore. The sentence held. Rosa glanced at Annie. The girl did not react outwardly, but Rosa knew she was listening to every word. Richard rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly looking not powerful, but tired in a human way. Then what do we do? It was a simple question, but in that house it sounded almost revolutionary. Rich men often asked who would handle a thing, not what ought to be done. Annie understood that even if she could not yet explain it, Catherine answered first. We keep him home for now. Richard nodded once, though his jaw remained tight. We tell the school Evan is not returning this week, she continued. No details. Not yet. Rosa, surprising herself, spoke from the doorway. That's wise. All 3 turned toward her. She straightened a little, aware of crossing an invisible line, but too old in hardship to retreat from common sense. Children tell more truth when they know the danger has been taken away first, she said. If he thinks he still has to go back tomorrow, he'll stay scared no matter what anybody asks. Richard regarded her for a moment. Then he gave one short nod. Agreed. Evan's shoulders changed at once. Only slightly, but enough. Annie saw it. Catherine did too. The relief was small and immediate. Like the first loosened knot in a rope, pulled too tight. Annie went to the shelf and took down the baseball glove. She held it in both hands and looked at Evan. You miss this. He nodded. Then that's one thing to get back. Richard watched her. You keep speaking as if recovery is simple. Annie shook her head. Not simple, just different. He frowned. Different how? She looked from him to Evan and answered in the plainest way possible. He ain't got to be made not scared all at once. He just needs to know he don't have to keep pretending. The room went quiet again, but it was not the same silence as before. This one had direction in it. Catherine sat back down beside Evan. You are not going back there this week, she said. The boy looked at her carefully as if adults had changed decisions on him before. Really, Richard added. And no one is forcing you into that car Monday morning. Something in Evan's face gave way then. Not a dramatic collapse, just the exhausted release of a child who had been bracing for impact too long. Tears slipped out and this time he did not wipe them away right away. Rosa looked down suddenly thinking of all the times Annie had come home quiet from school and she had asked the usual questions. How was your day? Did you finish your lunch? Was your reading test okay? Without always hearing the deeper thing beneath the answers. Motherhood taught vigilance, but poverty often stole time from listening. Annie climbed carefully onto the cushioned bench beneath the window and sat facing Evan. See, she said, that's part of saving you. For the first time since they entered the room, the corners of Evan's mouth moved. It was not a full smile, but it was close enough to make Catherine's eyes fill and Richard look away for one brief second. Outside, dusk was settling over the estate, blue and quiet against the glass. Downstairs, the rest of the household would be moving through evening routines as if nothing essential had shifted. But upstairs, in a room full of medicine, expensive furniture, and one frightened boy, the first real diagnosis had finally been spoken. Not disease, fear, not weakness, survival, not a body failing, but a child cornered. Richard Whitmore stood at the foot of the bed and looked at Annie, the daughter of the woman who cleaned his house, and understood with growing discomfort that every doctor he had hired had tried to cure symptoms, while a child with no training had gone straight to the wound. And as the room settled into that fragile new truth, he realized the next thing he would have to face was far worse than any medical bill. He would have to find out what kind of school, what kind of people, and what kind of father had allowed a boy to believe that pretending to be sick was safer than telling the truth. The next morning arrived quietly, as if the Whitmore estate itself had decided not to disturb what had been uncovered the night before. A pale gray light lay across the second-floor hallway, softening the edges of the portraits and silver-framed family photographs that lined the walls. Downstairs, the staff had already begun moving through the house in practiced silence. Coffee was brewing in the kitchen. A gardener's truck hummed somewhere beyond the back drive. The world, as it always did, seemed determined to go on as though truth did not rearrange everything it touched. But upstairs, Evan Whitmore was still asleep long after the time he would normally have been dressed and forced toward the car. Richard stood alone outside his son's bedroom door with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in his hand. He had not slept much. Men like Richard often mistook exhaustion for strength. And until recently, that mistake had served him well. It had helped him through mergers, lawsuits, market crashes, and all the quiet betrayals that built large fortunes. But there was a particular kind of sleeplessness that came only when a parent looked back over the past few months and realized the signs had been there all along. Sitting in plain sight like unpaid debts, stomach aches on Sunday nights, headaches on school mornings. The sudden pale silence in the car, the way Evan had begun to ask too casually whether he really had to go. Richard had heard all of it. He had simply filtered it through the wrong fear. He had thought illness first because illness was frightening but respectable. Illness came with protocols and specialists and printed recommendations. Fear was messier. Fear often pointed somewhere closer to home. He heard light footsteps behind him and turned. Annie was coming down the hall in the same cardigan she had worn the day before. Though Rosa had clearly brushed it clean and folded it overnight, her braids were neat again. She carried herself with the calm seriousness that no longer surprised him, though he had not yet decided whether that steadiness comforted him or unsettled him. You're up early, he said. Annie shrugged. My mama says houses this big don't really sleep. They just get quieter. Despite himself, one corner of Richard's mouth almost moved. She looked at the closed bedroom door. He's still sleeping. Yes, that's good. Richard studied her. Why? Because scared tired is different from regular tired. She said it as if it were obvious. When people finally stop being scared for a minute, sometimes they sleep hard. The child said things like that often now. And each time Richard had the uncomfortable feeling of being instructed by someone who had never held a degree in anything and yet kept reaching truths his experts had missed. He looked down at the coffee in his hand, then back at her. Your mother has been paid. Annie nodded as if she had expected no less once the matter was spoken plainly. Good. She almost didn't take the envelope. That brought a flicker of real reaction to Annie's face. Why? Richard gave a low breath. Pride, I imagine. Annie leaned against the wall, not slouching, just resting there with the easy confidence of a child who had not yet been taught to act intimidated in expensive hallways. My mama likes things to be right the first time, she said, not fixed after folks get embarrassed. The sentence was so clean it nearly made him laugh, though there was nothing funny in it. Your mother is not wrong. No, sir. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I owe her more than a paycheck. Annie looked at him carefully. Probably. That almost smile came closer this time, then disappeared again. Strange, Richard thought, how the child never softened to truth just because it landed on money. The bedroom door opened before he could say anything else. Catherine stepped out, dressed already for the day, but without her usual polished assurance. She looked tired in a way that made her seem more human than she had in the foyer yesterday. He's awake, she said softly. Her eyes moved to Annie. He asked if you were here. Richard felt something tighten in his chest at that. His son had asked for Annie before asking for him. He told himself not to take that personally, then took it personally anyway. Inside the bedroom, the curtains had been opened halfway. Morning light fell across the blanket and the rug and the shelf where the baseball glove still rested. Evan was sitting up more than he had the day before. His hair rumpled from sleep. The careful pour less arranged on his face now that the morning had not come with demands. When Annie entered, he looked at her first. Hey, she said. Hey, he answered, and just like that, something in the room eased. Rosa had come upstairs too, carrying a tray from the kitchen with toast, scrambled eggs, and sliced strawberries. She set it on the side table and gave Annie a look that was half warning, half trust. Richard noticed that, too. The two of them moved around each other with the silent understanding of people who had weathered hard seasons together. You should eat a little, Catherine said gently to Evan. Ordinarily, he would have looked at the tray as if it were another task. This time he glanced at Annie, then reached for a piece of toast. Richard noticed that, too. No doctor in 6 months had accomplished as much with pharmaceuticals as a little girl had accomplished by making the room less frightening. Annie sat on the bench by the window and watched him eat without comment. She did not praise him for taking a bite. She did not ask how he felt every 30 seconds. She simply stayed there, available and unarmed. And somehow that gave the meal a kind of normally the room had been missing. After a few moments she said, you still got that glove. Evan followed her gaze to the shelf. Yeah, you want it down. He hesitated then nodded. Richard moved, automatically reaching for it before anyone else could. The leather felt familiar in his hand and that familiarity carried a sting he had not expected. There had been afternoons in the yard not so long ago when he and Evan threw easy catches in the lowering light while Catherine called from the porch that dinner was getting cold. Those memories now seemed to belong to another family, one that had not yet learned how quickly fear could hollow out a house. He handed the glove to his son. Evan ran his fingers over the leather without putting it on. Annie watched him, then said, you don't got to do everything today. Richard looked at her. She was talking to Evan, but somehow the sentence reached farther than that. Catherine sat in the armchair near the bed, her hands folded in her lap. We called the school this morning, she said. You're not going back this week. Evan's shoulders dropped in visible relief. Okay. No arguments from them yet, Richard said, though his tone suggested he almost wished there had been. An adversary was easier for him to handle than his own regret. Annie tilted her head. You told them he was sick. The room went still for half a breath. Catherine answered carefully. We told them he would be absent for personal reasons. Annie seemed to think about that. That's better. Why? Richard asked. Because if you keep calling him sick, he's going to keep thinking that's the only safe reason. Catherine looked down. Richard was beginning to understand that Annie's greatest talent was not insight. Exactly, but the refusal to let adults lie to themselves in gentler language. Rosa stepped closer to the bed. Mr. Whitmore, she said, if I may. He nodded. She looked at Evan, not Richard. Children sometimes need a little ordinary before they can talk about hard things, she said. Breakfast, sunshine, a conversation that isn't about symptoms. It lets the body know danger has passed, at least for a while. Richard heard the nurse-like practicality in her tone. And for the first time since paying her wages, he felt the fuller shape of what he had nearly taken for granted. Not just her labor, her steadiness, her judgment, the quiet intelligence working people often had to hide because nobody wealthy liked being corrected by the help. What do you suggest? He asked. Rosa looked faintly surprised that he had asked at all. Let them sit together. Let Evan breathe. Then maybe later with less pressure, he'll say more. Annie nodded as if this were obvious. Richard gave one short nod back. Fine. So, the morning changed shape. Catherine went downstairs to cancel appointments. Rosa helped in the kitchen, though now with a different dignity in her posture. Subtle but real, Richard remained nearby, but tried awkwardly not to hover, and Annie stayed with Evan. For a while, they said almost nothing important. That too seemed to matter. Annie told him about a stray orange cat in her apartment complex that acted like it owned all 6 buildings. Evan told her there used to be a turtle in the pond near the lower drive, though he had not seen it in months. She asked if rich people ever got tired of all the stairs in their houses. He laughed, an actual laugh this time, quiet but unmistakable. Richard heard it from the hallway and stopped walking. That sound had become so rare in the house that it felt almost dangerous to hope from it. He stood there without entering the room and watched through the partly open door as Annie made some exaggerated face he could not quite see. And Evan shook his head and laughed again. No weakness, no hand to the forehead, no practiced fatigue, just a boy in bed with a glove in his lap and a child beside him who treated him like a person instead of a condition. For the first time, Richard saw the full shape of the performance, not as deception, but as refuge. That realization softened something in him and shamed him at once. A little later, Annie carried the breakfast tray back toward the hall, leaving Evan with the gloves still in his hands. Richard stepped aside to let her pass. He ate more, she said. I can see that. She started walking, then stopped and looked up at him. You're trying hard not to scare him. Richard let out a low breath. Am I succeeding? A little. He almost smiled again. Only a little. You ask big questions too fast. That one was fair. And what should I do instead? Annie thought for a moment. Serious as ever. Ask smaller ones. The kind people can answer without feeling trapped. Richard watched her head down the hall toward the staircase, small against the oversized elegance of the house, and felt the strange humility of being given parenting advice by a child who had spent her life watching adults fail each other honestly. Behind him in the room, Evan called softly. Dad. Richard turned at once and went inside. The boy looked down at the glove in his lap. Do you think, he said carefully, maybe later we could go outside? Not far. Just a little. Richard stood very still. Yesterday he might have called a doctor before allowing it. Last week he might have interpreted the request as a dangerous overexertion. But now looking at his son's face, he understood the question for what it was. Not a medical risk, but the first small reach back toward ordinary life. He sat on the edge of the chair again. Yes, he said later, if you still want to. Evan nodded, and that was all. Yet, Richard felt with surprising force that the room had shifted one more inch toward healing. Not because a cure had been found, not because the fear was gone, but because for the first time in months, his son was asking for something other than permission to stay hidden. By late afternoon, the Whitmore estate had settled into a strange new rhythm. One built not on certainty, but on caution. No specialists came through the front door. No nurse appeared with a clipboard and a careful smile. No one in a white coat stood at the foot of Evan's bed, asking him to rate his pain on a scale from 1 to 10, as if fear could be measured in numbers and filed in a folder. For the first time in months, the house did not revolve around his symptoms. It revolved around his comfort. And that difference, though invisible to most adults, changed everything. After lunch, Richard kept his promise. The sky outside had cleared into a pale cool blue, the kind that made the winter air look sharper than it felt. The lawn behind the house stretched broad and trimmed down toward the pond, where the bare trees reflected darkly in the water. Annie stood near the back terrace with her hands tucked into the pockets of her cardigan while Rosa hovered by the French doors, not interfering, but not far enough. A way to stop being a mother. Evan came down slowly, one step at a time, with Richard beside him and Catherine following close behind. He wore a navy sweater, jeans, and the uncertain expression of a boy who had spent too long indoors and was no longer fully convinced the outside world belonged to him. No one made a fuss when he reached the bottom of the stairs. That Annie had said earlier was important. So Richard only asked, "You all right?" And Evan nodded. They crossed the back terrace together. The cold breeze moved lightly through the hedges, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Somewhere near the lower field, a groundskeeper was packing tools into the back of a utility cart. The fountain at the side garden made a soft, steady sound, the sort that would have gone unnoticed on any ordinary day. Today, it felt almost like proof that the world had not ended. Simply because one frightened boy had finally said a hard thing out loud. Annie walked beside Evan at an easy pace, not slowing him with pity and not hurrying him with encouragement. Richard noticed that, too. She had an instinct for dignity that many adults never acquired. She let people keep as much of it as they could carry. "You still want to try?" she asked, nodding toward the baseball glove in Evan's hand. He looked at it, then at the lawn. "Maybe just one throw." Richard stepped onto the grass and held out his hand. "One throw sounds fine." Evan hesitated, then slid the glove onto his left hand. The motion was awkward from disuse, but not weak. Richard felt something tighten in his chest at the sight of it. How many signs had he missed? How many afternoons had his son chosen the bed because the bed came with fewer expectations and safer lies? He picked up the baseball from the terrace table where Catherine had set it earlier and tossed it gently, barely more than a short arc through the cold light. Evan caught it. The moment was so ordinary that it almost hurt. No applause followed. No one gasped. Annie wisely said nothing. She simply watched. Catherine pressed her lips together and turned slightly away as if she needed to hide the moisture that had gathered in her eyes. Rosa, standing by the doors, folded her arms tighter across her chest in the universal posture of women who had witnessed one small mercy and were already bracing for the next trouble. Richard tossed the ball again. Evan caught it again. On the third throw, the boy smiled before he seemed to realize he was doing it. There it was. Not recovery, not cure, something smaller, and because of that, more honest, a child remembering himself. Annie looked up at Richard. "See," he nodded once, but he could not yet trust his voice. They stayed outside only 15 minutes. Rosa insisted on that, and for once, no one challenged her judgment. When Evan came back inside, he was a little flushed from the cold and effort, but lighter somehow, as though movement had reminded his body that fear had not entirely claimed it. Later, after hot chocolate in the breakfast room and a quieter supper than usual, the house softened into evening. Catherine took a phone call in the library and closed the door. Rosa helped clear dishes with the kitchen staff, though now the women looked at her differently. News traveled in houses like that without ever admitting it traveled. They knew payroll had been corrected. They knew Mr. Whitmore had called accounting himself. They knew something important had happened upstairs, and though no one dared ask directly, respect had entered the edges of their manner. Not enough to undo the old hierarchy, but enough to show. Richard found Annie in the sunroom after dinner, curled into one corner of a long-upholstered bench with a book in her lap. The lamp behind her cast a warm circle of light over the pages and turned the windows into black mirrors. Outside, the garden was gone to darkness. "You read a lot," he said. Annie looked up. "Library books are free." He stood there a moment, hands in his pockets. "That sounds like a sentence your mother says." "It is." He almost smiled. Then the seriousness returned. "I need to ask you something." She closed the book around one finger to keep her place. "Okay. How did you know?" She tilted her head. "Know what?" "That this wasn't an illness in the way we thought." Annie considered him for a moment. Because sick people usually want grown folks to stop bothering them. Evan wanted to know if grown folks were going to make him go back. Richard did not answer. She went on because she could see he needed more than one sentence and because he always looked at you before he answered. Not like he was checking if he remembered right. Like he was checking what kind of answer was safe. Those words landed hard. Richard lowered himself into the armchair across from her, suddenly too tired to remain standing. "You make me sound like the problem." Annie did not rush to comfort him. That too was becoming a pattern. "Not the whole problem," she said, "but maybe part of why he stayed scared. The honesty of it would have offended him yesterday. Tonight it only exhausted him. I've tried to protect him." "I know. Do you?" She nodded. "But sometimes grown people protect kids from the wrong thing." Richard leaned back and looked at the dark window. His own reflection stared faintly back at him. Older than he felt inside. And what would the right thing have been? Annie answered immediately, asking why he was scared before asking how sick he was. Silence stretched between them, but not the bad kind. The kind that happened when a truth had already been accepted, and all that remained was deciding what to do with it. At last, Richard said, "Tomorrow, I'm going to speak with the school." Annie's fingers tightened slightly around her book. "Without him there?" "Yes, that's good." He looked back at her. "You don't trust them." "I don't trust people who let kids keep being scared." He let that sit for a moment. "Neither do I." From somewhere down the hall came the faint sound of Evan laughing just once, brief and light, at something Rosa had said in the kitchen. Richard turned his head instinctively toward the sound. His face changed when he heard it, softening in a way Annie had only begun to see in him. "He likes your mother," she said. Richard nodded. "He does. She talks to him normal." "So do you." Annie shrugged. "That's because he's normal. He just got stuck." Richard looked at her then. Really looked, and the simplicity of the statement nearly undid him. For months he had lived inside the language of specialists. Regression, behavioral fatigue, symptomatic presentation, complex pediatric stress response. And here was a child saying the thing that made more sense than all of it. He's normal. He just got stuck. A few minutes later, Rosa came to collect Annie for the ride home. She stood in the doorway of the sunroom with her purse over one shoulder and a weariness in her posture that no paycheck could erase in a single day. But there was something else there too. Relief perhaps, or at least the first cautious shape of it. "We need to get going," she said. Annie slid off the bench and tucked the book under one arm. Richard stood as they approached. Rosa met his eyes. "Thank you," she said, and there was dignity in the words, not submission for paying what was owed. He inclined his head. "You shouldn't have had to wait for it." "No," she said, "I shouldn't have." They held each other's gaze for 1 second longer than politeness required. In that second lived everything unsaid between them, his shame, her restraint. The fact that decency had arrived late, but been seen clearly when it came. Annie reached the doorway, then stopped and looked back at Richard. "Don't ask the school big questions tomorrow," she said. He blinked. "What kind should I ask?" "The kind liars don't practice for." Then she left with her mother, her small shoes quiet against the polished floor. Richard remained in the sunroom after they were gone, looking out at the dark garden and listening to the faint emptiness their departure left behind. Upstairs, Evan was no longer asking for medicine. He was asking whether Annie would come back tomorrow. That alone told Richard more than any specialist ever had, and as the house settled around him, elegant and troubled, and full of the private mistakes of powerful people, he understood that the next day would not be about doctors or diagnosis at all. It would be about a school, a frightened boy, and whether the truth looked different when asked in smaller questions. The next morning, Richard Whitmore drove to Whitmore Academy with the strange feeling that he was entering a building he had paid for many times without ever really seeing it. The campus sat on a rise of carefully kept land just outside Buckhead. All red brick, white columns, and old oaks arranged to suggest tradition, stability, and moral seriousness. It was the kind of school wealthy parents admired because it looked like discipline made beautiful. A row of black SUVs curved through the circular drive. Mothers in camel coats and pearl earrings stepped out holding coffee cups. Fathers in quarter zips took phone calls near the flagpole while children in navy blazers disappeared through the front doors beneath the school crest. Everything about the place announced excellence. That was how institutions hid rod best beneath Polish ritual and a Latin motto carved above the entrance. Richard parked, cut the engine, and sat for one moment without moving. The words Annie had said the evening before came back to him with unwelcome precision. Don't ask the school big questions tomorrow. Ask the kind liars don't practice for. He had spent most of the night thinking about that. Big questions invited prepared answers. Has there been bullying? Do you know why my son is afraid? Has anything inappropriate happened? Schools like this had rehearsed language for all of that. They had statements, protocols, liability-safe phrases polished by legal departments and polished again by administrators who knew how to sound concerned without admitting anything expensive. But smaller questions, those were different. Smaller questions slipped under a person's training. He stepped out of the car and headed inside. The front office smelled faintly of coffee, floor wax, and sharpened pencils. A receptionist with bright lipstick and practiced warmth stood as he approached. Mr. Whitmore, she said at once, recognizing him. Good morning. We weren't expecting. I'd like to see Headmaster Collins. There was enough in his tone to make her skip whatever pleasant reply she had prepared. Of course, sir. I'll let him know. 5 minutes later, Richard was shown into an office lined with framed diplomas, leather chairs, and shelves of old yearbooks meant to communicate continuity and trust. Headmaster Daniel Collins rose from behind a walnut desk, his silver hair neat, his tie conservative, his expression arranged halfway between concern and authority. Richard, he said, coming forward with a hand extended. I'm sorry to hear Evan won't be in this week. How is he feeling? Richard ignored the hand and remained standing. That depends on what you know. Collins let his hand fall with only a slight break in composure. I'm not sure I understand. I think you do. The headmaster gestured toward the chairs. Please. Richard sat, but not comfortably. He placed both hands on his knees and looked around the office at the photographs of football teams, debate champions, smiling graduates headed for Ivy League colleges. It was a room built to reassure men like him. Usually, it would have worked. Who supervises morning recess for 3rd grade? He asked. Collins blinked. It was exactly the kind of question he had not prepared for. Excuse me. Morning recess, Richard repeated. Who's out there? The Headham's brows drew together. Typically a rotation. Mrs. Dobbins, Coach Mercer, sometimes Mr. Hall. Richard nodded once. And which boys are usually in my son's class group during recess? Collins sat back more carefully. Now, Richard, if this is about some playground disagreement, I can assure you we take student behavior very seriously. That wasn't the question. A small silence passed. Collins folded his hands on the desk. The 3rd grade boys are assigned by homeroom and section. I'd need to see a current roster. Then pull it. Something changed in the room then. Not dramatically, just enough for the headmaster to understand that this was not a father dropping by to express concern and leave with a brochure about student wellness. This was a man who had come already suspecting more than the school wanted named. Collins pressed a button on the intercom. Would you ask Mrs. Harding to bring me the current 3rd grade class lists and recess rotation for Section B? As they waited, Richard looked at the framed photographs again. Has my son ever been reported as withdrawn in class? Collins answered too smoothly. Evan has always been a thoughtful child. That wasn't the question either. A faint stiffness entered the older man's mouth. He's quieter than some of the others. Since when? Collins hesitated. I couldn't say precisely, but his teacher could. The knock came then, saving him from answering. A secretary entered with 2 folders and placed them on the desk. Collins thanked her, waited until the door closed and opened the top file. Richard did not watch the papers. He watched Collins' face. It changed when he found something. Not much enough. There, Richard said. Collins looked up. There what? You saw a name that means something. The headmaster leaned back. Richard, I think you may be drawing conclusions before all the facts are in front of us. What I'm drawing, Richard said, his patience thinner than yours. That did it. Collins removed his glasses and set them carefully on the desk. A few boys can be unkind at times, he said in the cautious tone of a man stepping around legal fire. Nothing that rose to the level of formal disciplinary action. Unkind, Richard repeated. Is that what we call it here when a child starts pretending to be sick to avoid coming to school? For the first time, the headmaster lost full command of his face. It was only a moment, but Richard saw it and knew. He rose from the chair. Collins stayed seated, perhaps understanding that standing now would look defensive. I strongly advise we handle this discreetly. Who? A formal review. Names. The headmaster's voice lowered. Caleb Mercer, Thomas Weller, and occasionally Grant Hollis. Richard went still. The Mercer family funded the new science wing. The Weller boys' grandfather sat on the school's board of trustees. Hollis came from one of Atlanta's oldest real estate families. Of course, Richard thought. Of course, fear had money behind it. In institutions like this, cruelty was often tolerated longest when it wore a legacy last name. What did they do? He asked. Collins exhaled. There were remarks, teasing some locker room roughness after athletics exposure modules. My son doesn't play sports. Yes, Collins said carefully, which seems to have made him a target for boys who are less mature. Richard stared at him. You knew we were monitoring the social dynamic. The sentence was so bloodless, so sanitized that for one brief second, Richard almost laughed. Monitoring the social dynamic as if his son were not a child but whether, what exactly did you monitor? He asked. The names, the fear, the stomach aches, or just how much trouble it might be if parents found out the wrong children were doing it. Collins said nothing. That was answer enough. Richard placed both palms flat on the desk and leaned forward. Did his teacher know? The headmaster held his gaze, then looked away first. Mrs. Dobbins raised concerns about peer conduct in October. It was January now. A slow anger, cleaner, and more dangerous than shouting moved through Richard's chest. All those weeks, all those mornings, all those consultations, and the school had known enough to raise concerns while his son learned to choose a sick bed over the classroom. Why wasn't I told? Collins' reply came carefully arranged. There was concern about escalating ordinary childhood hierarchy into a larger conflict among prominent families. Richard straightened slowly. There it was, the true religion of places like this. Not education, not character, preservation, prominent families. For the first time that morning, he thought not like a father or a businessman, but like the child of old Georgia money, who had been taught from birth that institutions would always protect themselves first and call it tradition. Ordinary childhood hierarchy, he repeated. That's what you call a frightened boy who would rather perform illness than walk back into your building. Richard, no. His voice was quiet enough to be frightening. Now you listen to me. My son is not returning to this school until I decide what I'm going to do with what you've just admitted. Collins rose then, finally shedding some of his polish. I would ask you to be careful, rumors. You should have been careful with my son. The headmaster's face drained just a shade. Richard took the class list from the desk and looked at the names again. Mercer, Weller, Hollis. He would know their fathers. Of course, he would. Men who shook hands at fundraisers and sat on nonprofit boards and spoke publicly about leadership while their sons practiced cruelty under institutional cover. At the door, he paused. There was one more thing Annie had said. Ask the kind liars don't practice for. He turned back. One last question. Collins said nothing. When my son got sick enough to stop coming, did anyone here seem relieved? The headmaster's expression answered before his mouth did. Yes. Not relieved for Evan. Relieved for the school. Relieved that the problem had removed itself quietly. Richard left without waiting for the spoken version. Outside, the winter air hit his face hard and clean. Children's voices carried from the lower courtyard, sharp with laughter and running feet. Bells rang somewhere inside the main building. Life went on. It always did. That was one of the cruelest things about institutions that failed children. They kept operating beautifully around the wound. He stood beside his car and looked back at the brick facade, the columns, the shining windows. Yesterday, he would have seen prestige. Today, he saw something else. A handsome building full of adults who had known enough to protect themselves. He thought of Evan in bed, whispering, if I'm sick, nobody makes me go. He thought of Annie sitting in the sunroom the night before, book in hand, telling him not to ask rehearsed questions. He thought of Rose's quiet sentence in the bedroom. Children tell more truth when they know the danger has been taken away first. For the first time in months, everything was beginning to line up in a straight line, and that straight line led him not to another doctor, but back home to his son, to the names in his hand, and to the ugly fact that what had happened to Evan had not been invisible at all. It had been tolerated. Richard drove home with the class list folded once in the inner pocket of his coat, where it sat against his chest like a private accusation. The road back from Whitmore Academy wound through quiet streets lined with stone walls, winter lawns, and houses built large enough to protect their owners from almost everything except themselves. At every red light, he found his mind returning to Headmaster Collins' voice, polished and bloodless, speaking of social dynamics and ordinary childhood hierarchy, as though fear were a developmental phase instead of a wound. By the time he turned through the iron gates of his own estate, the anger inside him had settled into something colder and more useful. The house looked unchanged from the outside. White columns, black shutters, the fountain still running in the circular drive. Yet, as he stepped through the front door and handed his coat to the butler, he had the disorienting sense that the architecture had become dishonest. Too much beauty, too much order, too much silence around things that should have been named sooner. Catherine was waiting for him in the morning room, a legal pad open on the table beside untouched tea. She looked up the moment he entered. Well, Richard closed the door behind him. They knew enough. Her hand tightened around the pen. How much is enough? He crossed the room slowly, each sentence coming more controlled than the one before. Enough for the teacher to raise concerns in October. Enough for the headmaster to know which boys were involved. Not enough apparently to tell us because they didn't want conflict among prominent families. Catherine stared at him. October. He nodded. Her face changed. Not theatrically, not with shock alone. Something more humiliating. The look of a mother realizing that an institution she had defended at luncheons, paid generously into, and recommended to other parents had measured her son's suffering against donor politics and called silence prudence. Who are the boys? She asked. Richard gave her the names. Caleb Mercer, Thomas Weller, Grant Hollis. Catherine leaned back in her chair as though the room itself had shifted. Of course, she said, but there was no satisfaction in it. Of course, it would be those families, she knew them, too. Charity auctions, Christmas parties, school board dinners, men who joked about character and resilience over bourbon while their wives spoke of manners and standards, and carefully supervised children who had learned young that pedigree softened consequences. Richard looked toward the window where a weak winter sun touched the hedges beyond the terrace. Collins tried to minimize it, called it teasing, locker room roughness, boys being immature. And what did you call it? He turned back to her. What it is. She held his gaze, which as he did not answer immediately. Perhaps because the truthful words sounded harsher spoken in a room this civilized. A school protecting itself while a child learned to be afraid there. Catherine lowered her eyes for a moment. We have to talk to Evan again. We will, but not like yesterday. At that, something flickered across her face. A brief uncomfortable acknowledgement that a stranger's child had already taught them more in 24 hours than months of expensive parenting had managed to uncover. By noon, Rosa and Annie had returned. Richard heard the side door open from where he stood near the back hall, reviewing emails he was not reading. Rosa entered first, carrying her purse and lunch bag with Annie close beside her. The domestic rhythm of their arrival should have made the house feel ordinary again, but now nothing about Rosa seemed merely domestic. Richard noticed the slight lift in her posture that comes when a woman has finally been paid what she was owed and refuses to act grateful for basic justice. He noticed too the care with which Annie looked around as soon as she entered, as if checking the emotional weather of the house before saying a word. Mr. Whitmore, Rosa said. Rosa, she studied his face. You spoke to the school. It was not a question. Yes. Her expression tightened in a way that suggested she had expected no less and feared what it would reveal. And they knew. Annie looked up at him immediately, not surprised. Confirmed. Rosa let out one slow breath. That's usually how it goes. Richard glanced at her. Usually. She shifted her bag to the other shoulder. Places with money don't ignore trouble. They manage it. That's different. The sentence landed with the quiet authority of lived experience. Catherine, coming into the hall just then, heard it too and stopped a few steps away. We're going upstairs, she said. Evan asked if Annie was here. That request still did something to Richard each time he heard it. Though he was beginning to resent himself for minding it. A boy asked for the person who made him feel safe. That ought not to be an insult to anyone. Yet, fathers were often less noble in private than they imagined themselves to be. Upstairs, Evan was seated in the armchair by the window instead of in bed. It was the first thing Annie noticed. And because Annie noticed everything, she smiled before she reached him. Look at you, she said. That chair must have missed you. A faint smile touched Evan's mouth. It's not as far from the window. That's because it's a chair, Annie replied. Deadpan. They do that. He laughed, brief and unguarded. Richard remained near the door while Catherine moved inside and smoothed the blanket draped over the back of the chair. Rosa stood just behind Annie, quiet and watchful, letting the children have the center of the room. We need to ask you a little more about school, Catherine said gently. Evan's smile thinned, but did not vanish entirely. That alone was a change. Yesterday, the mention of school had seemed to freeze him from the inside. Today, the fear was still there, but it no longer owned the whole room. Richard pulled a chair over and sat down, taking Annie's advice before she had to give it. Smaller questions, smaller truths. Were they in your class? He asked. Evan nodded. Did they bother other kids, too? A hesitation, then another nod. Mostly boys they thought wouldn't tell. Rosa's eyes darkened. Catherine knelt beside the armchair. What did they do besides call you names? Evan looked down at his hands. They'd take my backpack and throw it over the stall doors in the locker room or hide my shoes after rec games. Caleb said if I told he'd say I cried all the time and make it worse. Richard felt his jaw harden. Annie sat cross-legged on the rug near the chair, making herself smaller on purpose, less like an audience and more like company. Did teachers ever see any of that? Not the locker room stuff, but they saw some things. Evan nodded. Mrs. Dobbins told Thomas to stop once. And did he? Annie asked. He gave her a look that answered before words did. Catherine's hand moved from the armrest to her son's wrist. Why didn't you tell us it was them? Evan stared at the carpet. Because Dad always says Whitmores don't let people push them around. Richard closed his eyes for 1 second. There it was again. Not only the school, not only the boys, the house, the language, the inheritance of masculinity dressed up as strength and handed down without tenderness. When have I ever said that to you? He asked. Though even as he asked it, he could hear himself in boardrooms, at charity sports events, on the sidelines of Little League years ago, when encouragement was often just pressure and a nicer tie. Evan answered in a small voice. When I quit soccer. Catherine looked at Richard. He remembered the day immediately. Evan had been younger, overwhelmed by the shouting and collision of boys on a hot field, asking after only 2 weeks if he could stop. Richard had laughed lightly and said, come on, son. Whitmores don't quit because things get uncomfortable. He had meant perseverance. The child had apparently heard something else entirely. I was wrong, Richard said. No one in the room moved. He said it again because some truths needed repetition before they felt real. I was wrong to say that. Evan looked up. For a child, one of the most destabilizing and healing things in the world is hearing an adult with power admit fault plainly without excuse. Annie knew that. Rosa knew that. Catherine, judging by her expression, knew it, too. Richard leaned forward, forearms on his knees. You do not owe anyone performance to prove strength, he said. Not at school, not here, and if someone hurts you, telling me is not weakness. It is exactly what I should have made safe for you to do. The room held that in silence. Then Annie, because she understood that truth alone was not enough unless it was followed by action, asked, so what happens now? Richard looked at her, then at Evan. Now I speak to the families involved. I speak to the board and I decide whether that school deserves another day of my son's trust. Evan's fingers tightened on the chair arm. Do I have to go back if they say sorry? No, Richard said immediately and without ambiguity. You do not have to go back because anyone says the right thing too late. A long breath left the boy's body. Rosa turned slightly away, perhaps to hide the emotion rising into her face. Catherine rested her hand over Evan's again. Annie only nodded as if the correct answer had been obvious from the beginning. Outside the window, a cold wind moved across the bare lawn and rattled the branches near the pond. Inside, in the room that had once been arranged around sickness, the first real structure of healing was taking shape. Not medicine, not diagnosis, safety, truth, apology, choice. Richard saw it now, though seeing it came with its own humiliation. For months, he had tried to rescue his son by controlling the problem. But children did not heal inside control. They healed inside trust. And trust, once broken by fear, was not rebuilt with specialists or speeches. It was rebuilt in rooms like this one with small honest questions, a chair by the window, and a father finally learning to say the one thing power almost always resists. I was wrong. Richard Whitmore made the first call that evening just after sunset, standing alone in his study with the door shut and the lights low. The room had always suited him. Dark walnut shelves, leather chairs, framed photographs from charity boards, business awards, and political dinners where men smiled with one hand in their pocket and lied with the other at their backs. It was a room built for control. Deals were made there. Damage was contained there. Difficult people were handled there. But tonight, the study felt less like a place of authority than a witness box. On the desk in front of him lay a sheet of paper with 3 names written in his own hand. Caleb Mercer, Thomas Weller, Grant Hollis. He stared at them a moment longer, then picked up the phone and called Caleb Mercer's father first. Jonathan Mercer answered on the 3rd ring. Smooth-voiced and warm in the way wealthy men often were with one another before trouble acquired a shape. Richard, good to hear from you. I was just saying to Laura, we haven't seen you and Catherine in weeks. Richard did not waste time. Your son has been tormenting mine. There was a pause on the line, small telling. Then Mercer laughed lightly, the way men laughed when they wanted to turn liability back into social misunderstanding. Now hold on, kids get under each other's skin. I'm sure whatever happened can be sorted out. Do not insult me by calling this ordinary. The warmth vanished. Mercer cleared his throat. What exactly are you alleging? Richard looked at the names again, though he did not need them now. Verbal harassment, isolation, intimidation, repeated incidents at school. Enough that my son would rather stay in bed pretending to be sick than walk back into that building. Silence, not denial, not yet, just calculation. That was what made Richard angriest. Mercer finally said, if Caleb was rough with the boy, I'll talk to him. Richard's voice lowered. You will do more than talk to him. You will understand that if this has been allowed to continue because your family name buys softness where consequences should be, that softness ends tonight. He ended the call before Mercer could recover. The second call was worse. Thomas Weller's father came on defensive from the first sentence as though some current of warning had already reached him through the invisible channels rich people trusted more than honesty. Richard, before this gets out of hand, I'm sure there are 2 sides here. Richard stood very still at the desk. My son spent months becoming smaller in order to survive what your son and others thought was entertainment. Weller scoffed. Boys can be merciless, sure, but if Evan's sensitive, Richard's hand tightened around the phone hard enough that his knuckles blanched. Choose your next word very carefully. The silence that followed was a frightened one. Weller tried again, softer this time. I'm not excusing anything. I'm only saying these things can escalate in memory once a child gets anxious. There it was. The old trick. Reframe harm as interpretation. Shift from what happened to how the victim received it. Make cruelty a matter of temperament. Richard ended that call too, but not before saying, I am no longer interested in how comfortable you were with this. I am interested in what your son did. He left Hollis for last. Grant Hollis's mother answered instead. And unlike the other 2 parents, she did not posture first. She sounded tired before Richard had even said the full sentence. I know, she said quietly after he named the issue. I know something's been wrong. Richard leaned back against the desk. How long? Long enough that Grant's been saying things at home about weak boys and soft boys and how some kids ought to learn to take a joke. She paused. I asked him where he learned that language, and he wouldn't answer me. For the first time that evening, Richard heard something on the other end of the line that was not strategy. It sounded like shame. I'm not calling for apologies, he said. No, she replied. You're calling because your son was failed. He looked out the dark window of the study. Somewhere beyond the glass, the ground stretched white and silent under the winter sky. Yes, when the call ended, he stayed in the study for several minutes without moving. The house around him had gone into evening quiet, dishes cleared, staff dismissed, lamps on, cease. The small domestic signals of a family trying to return to normal after a day that had removed all possibility of normal. He thought of Annie's face in the upstairs bedroom, steady and unstartled, as if truth were never the emergency adults made it into. He thought of Rosa's sentence from earlier. Places with money don't ignore trouble. They manage it. That's different. He had spent most of his life being on the safe side of. That difference, that recognition did not make him noble. It made him ashamed. When he went upstairs, he found Catherine in the sitting room adjoining their bedroom, still dressed, though she had removed her earrings and folded them onto the side table beside a cold cup of tea. She looked up the moment he entered. Well, he loosened his tie and dropped into the chair opposite hers. Mercer minimized. Weller blamed temperament. Hollis's mother may be the only adult in this whole circle who still recognizes a conscience when it visits. Catherine closed her eyes briefly. That bad? Yes. She was quiet for a moment, then asked. And the school? I'm speaking to the board tomorrow. That made her sit straighter. All of them? Yes. She gave a low breath. That will not stay private. Richard looked at her. It shouldn't. For years, that would have been enough to stun her. Richard Whitmore had built a career partly on timing, containment, and the elegant delay of public damage. But this was something else now. A father's willingness to let reputations crack if that was what truth required. Catherine studied him, perhaps seeing the shift with more clarity than he did himself. Do you want me there? He answered without thinking. Yes. The words seemed to steady her. Down the hall, they could hear movement from Evan's room. Not distress, just life. A drawer opening, Annie's voice drifting briefly from the landing where Rosa must have been collecting her. A laugh, small, quick, real. Richard turned his head toward the sound. He asks for her before he asks for either of us, Catherine said quietly. He did not pretend not to know who she meant. I know. Does that bother you? He looked back at her, then gave a tired, honest answer. Yes. Catherine nodded, not judging him for it. Me, too. That shared admission softened something between them, though I suspect, she added. What bothers me more is knowing exactly why. Richard leaned forward, elbows on his knees. She made him feel safe in 2 days. Catherine's mouth tightened, and we mistook fear for illness in our own child. He did not answer. There were some marriages that could not survive the plain naming of failure. But old marriages, if they had any worth to them at all, sometimes learned how to look at damage without immediately deciding who to blame first. Catherine crossed one leg over the other and said, We may not have caused what happened at that school, Richard, but we built a house where he thought proving strength mattered more than saying he was afraid. The sentence hurt because it was true and because he had no defensible reply. After a while, he rose and walked down the hall to Evan's room. The door was partly open. Inside, the lamp by the bed was on, but the overhead lights were dimmed. Rosa was helping straighten the blankets while Annie stood near the bookshelf, reading the backs of some adventure novels, as if she were inspecting a small library she might approve of, only selectively. Evan was already in bed again, but he looked different from the boy who had occupied that same bed 2 days ago. Not healed, not untouched, simply more present. Rosa looked up when Richard entered. We were just heading out. He nodded. Thank you. She gave the smallest pause before answering. For what? The question was not disrespectful. It was precise. Rosa Johnson had spent too many years around people who thanked workers in place of treating them fairly. She was not going to let gratitude become another elegant form of avoidance. For helping him feel normal, Richard said. She seemed to weigh the sentence, then accepted it with a small nod. Children need that more than adults think. Annie came over to Evan's bedside and handed him one of the books from the shelf. This one's better than the other one, she said. The dog doesn't die. Evan gave a weak laugh. How do you know? I read the ending first. That's cheating. That's being emotionally prepared. Even Rosa smiled at that. When Annie and her mother had gone, Richard sat in the chair beside Evan's bed. For a while, neither of them spoke. The room was quiet except for the faint rustle of pages. As Evan turned the book over in his hands, then the boy asked without looking up, Did you talk to them? Yes. All of them. Yes. Another pause. Are they mad? Richard considered the question. It was the kind children asked when they were still measuring whether justice would somehow become their fault. Probably, he said, but that doesn't matter. Evan nodded, though he did not look entirely convinced. Richard chose his next words carefully. None of this is yours to carry. That brought the boy's eyes up. I should have seen more. Richard continued. I didn't. That is on me. But what those boys did and what that school allowed belongs to them. Evan looked down at the book again. What if people say I made too big a deal out of it? Richard felt something cold and protective rise through him. Then they can say it to me. The boy was quiet for several seconds. Then he said in a smaller voice, Okay. Richard stayed until Evan's eyes grew heavy and the book slid lower in his hands. When he finally stood to leave, he switched off the lamp and paused in the doorway. The house beyond the room was dim and still. Somewhere downstairs, the old clock marked the hour. In that hush, it occurred to him that for the first time in months, he was not planning another medical consultation or reviewing test results or arranging private treatment. He was preparing for something far simpler and, in its own way, far more difficult. He was going to tell powerful people that their comfort no longer mattered more than the truth. And back in his own room, Catherine lay awake, listening for his steps. While Rosa drove home through the cold Georgia night with Annie asleep in the passenger seat, her head tipped against the window, unaware that she had already done the hardest part. She had made a powerful man stop protecting the wrong things. The board meeting was held the next afternoon in a room designed to make difficult conversations feel civilized. Whitmore Academy's trustees gathered around a polished mahogany table beneath oil portraits of former headmasters and benefactors whose names were still stitched into scholarships, wings, and annual giving campaigns. The room smelled faintly of coffee, old paper, and expensive restraint. At one end sat Satins, headmaster, his posture carefully composed, despite the fatigue now visible around his eyes. Along the sides of the table sat the usual guardians of prestige: bankers, attorneys, one retired judge, two women who chaired nearly every respectable charity in Atlanta, and men who had spent decades confusing influence with moral judgment. Jonathan Mercer was there, as was Thomas Weller's father. Hollis's mother had come alone. Richard entered with Catherine beside him and did not sit immediately. That alone changed the room. Usually, he moved easily in places like this, exchanging greetings, lowering himself into a chair only after the proper nods and half-smiles had been exchanged. But today, he stood with both hands at his sides, and looked around the room as if he were taking inventory not of people, but of failures. "Richard," Collins began, his tone careful, "we appreciate your coming in. We all share your concern for Evan, and hope we can resolve this in a way that serves everyone involved." Richard looked at him. "If by everyone you mean my son and the boys who helped drive him out of your school, then no, their interests are not equal." Silence followed. Catherine took the chair beside Richard, but said nothing. She had chosen a dark green suit and pearls, the uniform of a Southern woman entering a room where men expected diplomacy and were about to receive judgment. Her face was composed, but there was nothing soft in it now. Richard sat at last. "I'm not here for a discussion about language," he said. "I'm here because this institution knew enough to notice a child was being targeted, knew enough to identify the boys involved, knew enough that a teacher raised concerns in October, and still said nothing to his parents. While that child became so frightened he preferred to perform illness rather than return." Mercer shifted in his chair. Weller's mouth tightened. Collins folded his hands in front of him, a posture that suggested process, oversight, and the hope that if things were named slowly enough, accountability might become negotiable. One of the trustees, an older man with silver hair and a tie patterned with tiny school crests, cleared his throat. "Before this becomes more inflamed than necessary, perhaps we should remember that childhood conflicts can present in complicated ways." Richard turned his head and fixed the man with such a flat stare that the rest of the sentence died in the trust's throat. "Childhood conflict," Richard said. "That is what we are calling repeated intimidation now." The retired judge seated 3 chairs down, lifted one hand slightly. "No one is minimizing your son's distress." Hollis's mother spoke before Richard could answer. "That is exactly what has been happening." Every head turned toward her. She sat very straight in her chair, hands folded tightly enough to reveal the tension in them. "My son has been speaking in ways that should have warned me months ago. I did not act quickly enough, and I will answer for that at home. But this school knew more than it admitted. Let's not insult everyone here by pretending otherwise." Jonathan Mercer let out a small breath through his nose. "With respect, we do not yet know the full nature of these allegations." Catherine turned toward him then, and whatever old social ease had once existed between them was gone. "You keep using the word allegations," she said. "My son spent months trying to disappear from his own life. What more evidence of harm satisfies you?" Mercer had no answer ready that did not make him look monstrous. Weller leaned forward, palms on the table in a posture that tried for reason. "My understanding is that there was teasing. Boys can be cruel before they learn better. That doesn't excuse it, but it may not justify the kind of scandal this could become." Richard looked at him with the cold clarity of a man who had finally stopped caring whether comfort survived the meeting. "The scandal is not that this might become public," he said. "The scandal is that your first instinct is still to protect the word public rather than the child." No one spoke. Outside the tall windows, winter light slanted across the lawn, pale and indifferent. Inside, the portraits on the walls seemed suddenly less dignified than watchful, as if generations of respectable men had been sitting in rooms like this one for decades, teaching one another how to sound honorable while protecting the wrong things. Collins broke the silence. "Richard, no one disputes that mistakes were made." "Mistakes," Richard repeated. "A missing permission slip is a mistake. Forgetting a deadline is a mistake." This was a pattern of knowledge followed by inaction. The retired judge removed his glasses and polished them slowly, perhaps to buy time. "Then what exactly are you asking for?" The room understood that was the real question, not whether harm had been done. Not really. The old machinery had already moved past that, toward consequence, toward cost, toward what might be required to make this painful truth survivable for those who had failed. Richard answered without hesitation. "A full internal review with outside counsel. Written notification to every parent in the grade that a bullying investigation is underway. Immediate disciplinary action pending review for the boys involved. A formal record of every concern raised by staff since October. And I want Mrs. Dobin spoken to today, not because I think she caused this, but because I want to know exactly how much she tried to say before the institution taught her to soften it. Mercer gave a short, disbelieving laugh. You want to burn the school down over playground behavior. Richard turned to him with a slowness more threatening than speed. No, I want to stop a system that taught my son silence was safer than truth. Mercer's face reamed. Caleb is not some violent delinquent. No, Richard said, he is worse than that in one very American way. He is a well-bred boy who seems to have learned that if his family is connected enough, cruelty will be renamed before it reaches consequence. The sentence struck the room with enough force that even Collins looked down. Hollis's mother closed her eyes briefly, as if she had been waiting all afternoon for at least one adult to say what everyone with a conscience already knew. Weller tried one final pivot. Surely we can resolve this without humiliating children. Catherine spoke then, and her voice held the hard elegance of a woman who had spent years understanding exactly how families like theirs maintained reputations. My son has already been humiliated, she said repeatedly, quietly, thoroughly. You are not objecting to humiliation. You are objecting to whose child may finally feel it. That ended him for the first time since entering the room. Richard felt not just anger, but a kind of grim respect for his wife. He had known Catherine as polished, social, strategic. He had perhaps forgotten in the long ease of marriage that women like her often learn to read the moral weather of rooms faster than men blinded by power. Collins drew in a measured breath. If we agree to the review and the notifications, I would strongly urge discretion. In how this has framed the school's reputation, Richard stood. The movement was abrupt enough to make two trustees straighten instinctively. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to for months, he said. My son has been carrying the burden of this school's discretion in his own body. He will not carry it one day longer. The room went utterly still. He let the silence settle before continuing. You want to know what I learned in the last 3 days? That fear when ignored by the people meant to protect a child does not disappear. It turns inward. It learns to mimic illness. It learns to live in a bed, in a stomach ache, in a silence polite adults call sensitivity. And every one of you sat inside an institution that watched this happen slowly enough to get used to it. No one interrupted. Richard placed both hands on the back of his chair and looked around the table, meeting every gaze. I do not care what language you use in your minutes. I do not care which donor calls tonight or whose wife cries at the idea of embarrassment. My son is done paying for other people's comfort. When he sat back down, the room felt changed. Smaller somehow, less able to hide behind procedure. The retired judge was the first to yield. The review should happen, he said quietly. One of the women from the charity boards nodded next, and the parents must be notified. Collins looked as though he had swallowed something sharp. Mercer stared at the table. Weller's expression had gone defensive and hollow at once. Hollis's mother gave the faintest nod, not of approval, but of recognition. Once the first crack came, the rest followed. Language was negotiated, timelines argued, counsel named, but the essential thing had already happened. The room had lost its ability to pretend the matter was only social, only delicate, only something to be managed. By the time Richard and Catherine left the campus, the winter light had gone silver and low. They walked to the car in silence at first, passing parents and students who moved through the late afternoon with the ordinary ease of people who had not yet heard the ground shifting beneath a place they trusted. At the passenger door, Catherine stopped. You were right to force it. Richard looked across the roof of the car at her. You said as much in there. I know. She held his gaze, but I'm saying it now as his mother, not as your ally in a room full of cowards. He gave a tired breath that almost became a laugh and didn't. That room used to make sense to me. It still does, she said. That's the problem. On the drive home, neither of them spoke much. There was too much to absorb and too much still ahead. But the silence between them was no longer made of confusion. It was made of consequence. When they reached the estate, Annie and Rosa were already there. Richard found them upstairs in Evan's room. Rosa sat in the armchair near the window, folding a small stack of clean clothes from the laundry basket with the same patient care she brought to every practical task. Annie sat cross-legged on the rug, reading aloud from the dog book she had chosen the night before. Evan was on the edge of the bed, listening with the kind of open attention that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. He looked up when Richard entered. How'd it go? Richard crossed the room slowly. He did not answer right away because he had learned at last that children deserve the truth in a size they could carry. The school is going to be investigated, he said. The adults there can't pretend they didn't know anymore. Evan searched his face. Am I in trouble? The question nearly undid him. No, Richard said at once, kneeling until he was level with the boy. You were the one who was wronged. Evan's shoulders lowered. Annie closed the book in her lap. That's what I told him. Richard glanced at her, then back to his son. There will be people who wish this had stayed quiet, he said. That is not your burden. It is mine. Rosa, still folding clothes, looked up briefly at that. Something in her eyes suggested she understood exactly what it cost a man like Richard Whitmore to say such a thing out loud. Perhaps she also understood that saying it was only the beginning. Catherine stepped farther into the room. And yours is to get better, she said softly. Not for them. For you. For the first time, Evan seemed to believe her. He looked down at his hands, then over at Annie. Do you think they'll really make it different? Annie thought about it seriously. Maybe some, maybe not enough. Then she added with the calm honesty that had become the moral center of the whole house. But now they know somebody's watching. Evan smiled a little at that. Richard did too, though his smile was brief and almost painful, because she was right. Institutions changed less from conscience than from witness, and one small child had become witness before anyone else dared to be. Later that evening, after dinner had been eaten, and the house had quieted again, Richard stood at the upstairs landing and looked down over the foyer where this whole new life had begun with a demand for unpaid wages and a child's unshakable certainty. He thought of all the things he had once believed made a man strong: control, provision, foresight, command. Now another word had entered the list, one he had undervalued for most of his life. Listening and somewhere below him, Annie laughed at something Rosa had said in the kitchen. While in the room down the hall, his son no longer looked like a mystery to be solved, but a child finally being seen. That night, for the first time in months, Richard Whitmore did not fall asleep thinking about doctors. He fell asleep knowing that justice, once invited into a house, had a way of moving from room to room until nothing dishonest remained comfortable. By the end of the week, the change in Evan Whitmore could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. It showed first in the mornings. For months, breakfast in the Whitmore house had revolved around absence. A tray sent upstairs, toast gone cold, juice untouched, a child too exhausted, too pale, too unwilling to face the day. Now little by little, that ritual began to break apart. On Thursday, Evan came downstairs before 10 o'clock and sat in the breakfast room wearing a navy sweater and house slippers. His hair still rumpled from sleep, but his eyes clearer than they had been in months. He did not eat much at first, only half a biscuit and a few slices of apple, but he sat at the table without looking trapped by it. On Friday, he asked for scrambled eggs. No one in the room said anything too enthusiastic. That had become an unspoken rule. Annie had taught them that much without ever announcing it. Don't turn every normal thing into a performance. Let the child keep his dignity. So, Rosa only set the plate down with a calm, "Here you go, honey." And Catherine poured juice as if there were nothing miraculous in appetite. Returning once, fear loosened its grip. But Richard noticed everything. He noticed the way Evan reached for the salt without hesitation. The way he leaned sideways when Annie whispered something to him, and a laugh escaped before he could stop it. The way his shoulders no longer curled inward every time the day was mentioned. Even his color looked different. Not fully restored, but less haunted. That morning, as sunlight stretched over the breakfast room floor, and the silver coffee pot caught the light, Richard stood by the window with his cup in hand, and watched his son be ordinary. It nearly broke his heart, not because the sight was tragic, but because it was so simple, so available, so close all along. If only someone had known to ask the right question instead of paying for the most sophisticated wrong answer. Annie sat across from Evan, her legs swinging lightly beneath the chair, tearing pieces from a biscuit and dipping them in honey as if she had eaten in rich people's breakfast rooms all her life and found them mildly overrated. "Told you," she said under her breath. Evan glanced at her. "Told me what?" "That once you stop pretending, your body stops trying so hard, too." Rosa heard it while setting fruit on the sideboard. She did not interrupt, though Richard saw the quiet recognition in her face. She had worked enough years around illness, fear, and working-class survival to know that bodies often carried what mouths could not say. Catherine looked at Richard from across the room. Neither of them spoke. They no longer needed to narrate every improvement to each other. That was another thing the week had taught them. Not every truth needed to be managed out loud before it could be real. Later that day, Evan asked if he could walk down to the lower garden. It was a small request, barely larger than the one he had made for the backyard the afternoon before, but it marked another step away from the bed that had become his refuge and prison both. Richard offered to go with him immediately, then caught himself. Big questions, big reactions, big shadows. Annie's lessons had not left him, so instead he said, "That sounds fine. Whenever you're ready." Evan chose after lunch. The air outside was crisp but bright. One of those Georgia winter afternoons when the cold remained polite as long as the sun stayed out. The lower garden sat beyond the terrace and down a stone path lined with sleeping hydrangeas and trimmed boxwoods. There was a small iron bench near the fountain and a patch of dormant rose bushes Catherine loved every spring. Rosa came too, carrying a light blanket over one arm just in case. Though no one pointed out the fact that she moved through the family's garden now with more comfort than she had a week ago. Money could establish property, it could not establish moral authority nearly so quickly. Annie walked beside Evan with that same unforced pace she always used, never hurrying him, never offering pity disguised as encouragement. Richard followed several steps behind, and Catherine stayed near the path, speaking occasionally with Rosa about practical things, groceries, the weekend, church attendance, like women building a bridge between unequal lives out of the ordinary materials available to them. At the fountain, Evan sat on the iron bench and tilted his face toward the light. The water made a soft looping sound in the basin. Somewhere farther off, a bird called from the bare branches near the back fence. "I forgot this was here," he said. Annie looked at him sideways. "A whole fountain?" "No. Sitting outside when nobody's asking what's wrong with me." Richard stopped walking. The sentence was not cruel. It was not even accusing. Children rarely meant their most devastating truths to be either. They simply spoke from the place where things had hurt them longest. Catherine lowered her eyes. Rosa looked away toward the rose bushes, granting the family the privacy of being wounded in front of her without having to see it fully reflected back. Richard came closer at last and sat on the far end of the bench. "I'm trying to learn that," he said. Evan nodded once, still watching the fountain. After a minute, Annie stood up and wandered to the edge of the path where a few camellia leaves had gathered in the grass. She kicked at them gently with the toe of her shoe. "You know what's funny?" she asked. "What?" Evan said. "You were trying so hard to act sick that everybody forgot to ask if being at home was actually helping." He frowned a little. "What do you mean? You don't look scared all the time here now." The remark seemed to surprise him. He thought about it seriously, then said, "I guess I'm not." Richard looked at his son. "Are you sleeping any better?" "A little. Any headaches?" Evan shrugged. "Not really." There it was again, piece by piece, symptom by symptom, the body giving back what fear had stolen. That evening, Richard received the first formal letter from the school's outside counsel confirming the investigation process, parent notification timeline, and interim disciplinary restrictions for the boys involved. It was written in the polished legal language institutions used when they wanted to appear morally responsive while revealing as little human feeling as possible. Catherine read it at the dining room table and set it down with a look of faint disgust. "They've managed to write 3 pages without using the word child once," she said. Rosa, who had stayed late that evening to finish linens in the upstairs guest rooms, happened to pass the doorway and heard the remark. "That's because when people want to protect systems, they stop talking like children or people," she said. Richard looked up from his own copy of the letter. Rosa paused, perhaps aware she had spoken more freely than the old arrangement between them once would have permitted, but too much had changed now to pretend otherwise. "I'm sorry," she said, though she did not sound sorry. "Don't be," Catherine replied. Richard folded the letter in half. "She's right." Rosa gave a single nod and moved on down the hall, leaving behind the faint scent of starch and lemon soap. That night, after dinner, Evan did something none of them had expected so soon. He brought down one of his school sketchbooks from upstairs and set it on the coffee table in the family room. "I want to throw this away," he said. Richard looked at the book. Catherine looked at Evan. Annie, sitting cross-legged on the rug with a card game spread in front of her, tilted her head. "Or keep it so one day you can remember you're not there anymore." Evan considered that maybe Catherine sat beside him on the sofa and opened the sketchbook slowly. The first pages held ordinary things, a dog, a tree, a baseball cap, a lopsided cartoon of the house. Then farther in, the drawings changed. Darker pencil strokes, smaller figures. A classroom with one child drawn apart from the others, a locker room. A stick figure curled inward under 3 taller ones marked only by heavy pressing lines. Richard felt his stomach turn. "Did you draw these at school?" he asked. Evan nodded. "And no one saw. I kept the book closed." Annie looked up from the floor. "That's still talking, you know. Just not where grown folks were looking." No one answered because there was nothing to correct in it. Richard took the sketchbook and turned the pages one by one, seeing his son's fear rendered in pencil, where he had once only seen unexplained fatigue. It came to him then with cold, humiliating force that Evan had been telling the truth in every language available to him. Stomach aches, silence, withdrawal, drawings, avoidance. The problem was not that the child had not communicated. The problem was that adults had only honored the forms of pain they already understood how to discuss at dinner parties. He closed the book and set it down carefully. "Do you still want me to keep talking to the school?" he asked. Evan looked at him as though the answer should have been obvious. "Yes, then I will." The boy nodded and leaned back into the sofa cushions, suddenly looking tired again, but this time it was the tiredness of emotional use, not trapped fear. Annie dealt another card onto the rug and said without looking up, "That's the miracle part." Richard turned toward her. "What is getting believed before you're all the way broken?" The room went still around that sentence. Catherine covered her mouth for a second. Rosa, who had just returned from upstairs with folded towels in her arms, stopped in the doorway. Even Evan looked at Annie as if she had reached into the center of something none of them had managed to name properly. Richard said nothing at first. There are moments when a truth enters a room so completely that replying too quickly only makes a person seem smaller. At last he looked at his son and answered in the only way that mattered. "Then that's what we're going to do," he said. "Believe you before anything else gets the chance to hurt you again." And in the warm quiet of that family room, with winter dark settling against the windows and the ordinary comforts of lamplight and folded laundry and children's voices gathering where fear had once ruled, everyone felt the shape of healing change again. It was no longer just escape. It was beginning slowly and unmistakably to become restoration. By Monday, the Whitmore house no longer felt like a place organized around sickness. It still carried the habits of the past months in small ways. The medicine tray remained on the kitchen counter because no one had yet moved it. The extra thermometers were still in the upstairs bathroom drawer. The stack of specialist business cards still sat in a silver tray on Richard's desk. As though all that expensive certainty might somehow become useful again if left visible long enough. But the atmosphere had changed. The house no longer held its breath around Evan. It listened to him instead. That morning, he came downstairs dressed before anyone called for him. Rosa was in the kitchen helping one of the cooks with breakfast, sleeves rolled up, moving with the practical ease of a woman who had spent her whole life making comfort out of whatever was available. Annie sat at the big farmhouse table in the staff side of the kitchen with a pencil tucked behind one ear, finishing a worksheet from school. Richard had once been vaguely aware that children like Annie came attached to the working lives of women like Rosa, trailing through side rooms and waiting quietly in corners because childcare cost money and pride alone never solved logistics. Now he noticed the details. The way Annie erased carefully trying to keep the paper neat. The way Rosa glanced over every few minutes without seeming to. The kind of watchfulness working mothers perfected because the world rarely watched with them. Evan entered the room rubbing sleep from one eye. No one stopped moving. No one gasped his name or asked if he felt all right in the solemn tone that had come to define the last several months. Rosa only looked up and said, "Morning, honey. Pancakes or eggs?" The boy hesitated for a moment, perhaps still surprised by being treated like a child instead of a case file. "Pancakes," he said. "Good choice," Annie muttered without looking up from her worksheet. "Eggs are too serious for Monday." That earned a laugh from Evan and one from the cook, and even Rosa smiled into the skillet. Richard stood in the doorway for a second longer than necessary, watching it all. The ordinary sound of breakfast spatulas, low talk, the clink of plates had become more healing than any machine he had paid for. He stepped fully into the room. "Morning." Evan looked up. "Morning, Dad." There was no shadow in the exchange. No WSE, no performance. Just a father and son sharing the first word of the day in a kitchen that smelled like butter and coffee instead of anxiety. After breakfast, Catherine suggested that Evan spend a little time outside again before the cold turned sharper. He agreed at once, and that alone felt like evidence, not of complete recovery, but of willingness. Children in fear often learn to resist anything that might expose them. Children beginning to heal reached toward life almost before they understood they were doing it. The garden was pale with winter sun. Annie and Evan walked the stone path toward the lower lawn while Richard and Catherine followed several steps behind. Rosa stayed on the terrace, folding small towels from the laundry basket she had carried out with her, because work did not vanish simply because a family was in crisis, and because women like Rosa often felt more comfortable helping from nearby than standing ceremonially still. At the bottom of the path near the pond, Evan paused and looked across the water. "It's weird," he said. "What is?" Annie asked. "Everything's the same, but it doesn't feel the same." Annie shoved her hands into her cardigan pockets. "That's because you're not trapped in it the same way." He looked at her. "You say things like, 'You're 80. My grandma says truth don't need to be old to be true.'" Richard heard that from a short distance away and felt again the strange discomfort of being parented in fragments by the child of the woman he had underpaid. He had lived long enough to know that humiliation could be holy if it forced a man into better alignment. That knowledge did not make it pleasant. They walked farther than before, past the bench, past the fountain, near the row of dormant hydrangeas, where the grass opened into a wider stretch of yard. Evan's face reened a little from the cold and movement, but the tiredness that came into him now looked natural, earned, clean. Not the gray heaviness that had once followed every mention of school. Catherine touched Richard's sleeve lightly. "Look," he did. Evan had bent to pick up a stick and was using it to draw shapes in the dirt. While Annie argued with him about whether the sketch looked more like a dinosaur or a badly parked pickup truck. There was no fragility in the moment, no audience, no medical language waiting to turn it into a sign. It was just children being ridiculous in the winter sun. "I didn't think I'd miss that," Catherine said quietly. "What?" The sound of him not being careful. Richard glanced at her. The sentence held more than nostalgia. It held confession. Their son had learned caution too young. Every parent believed they would notice when that happened. Few did. When they came back inside, Richard found Drive Harlan sitting in the library. The pediatric specialist had been part of Evan's treatment team for nearly 3 months. A polished man in his late 50s with silver-framed glasses and a reputation for calm under pressure. Richard had not invited him that day. Catherine had called the office over the weekend to cancel further appointments, and apparently the doctor had come in person to check on the child. Men in his profession did not like unexplained recoveries. They threatened expertise. "Doctor." Harlan rose as Richard entered. "I was hoping to see Evan." Richard closed the library door behind him. "Why?" The doctor gave a mild surprised smile. "Because I've been treating him." "No," Richard said. "You've been treating symptoms." That took the smile off his face. "I'm not sure I follow." "Yes, you do." Richard remained standing. He had stopped offering chairs to people who had mistaken the central problem and then expected courtesy before humility. "My son's condition improves every day. He is not forced toward the source of his fear." "Doctor." Harlan adjusted his glasses. "Psychological stress can aggravate pediatric presentations. That does not mean the original complaints were not real." Richard thought of the untouched broth trays, the blood draws, the scans, the discussions conducted at the foot of Evan's bed as though the boy were a case study rather than a listening child. "The complaints were real," he said. "Your interpretation was wrong." That landed. There was a pause before the doctor said more carefully. "If the boy was experiencing school-based trauma, that should have been part of the family's initial disclosure." Richard stared at him. You were telling me that if I had known enough to disclose it, I would not have needed you to identify it. Doctor. Harlan opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence between them sharpened into something almost clinical in its own way. Diagnosis of a different sort, not illness now, but the limits of expertise when it met class confidence and parental desperation. Richard spoke more quietly. Children do not always report fear in language. Adults find respectable. I paid you to know that. The doctor lowered his eyes for a brief moment. Then I failed to widen the inquiry. It was not an apology exactly, but it was closer than most men in authority came without being dragged. Richard gave a short nod. Yes. By the time he left the library, the medicine tray had finally been removed from the kitchen counter. Rosa had done it without ceremony. Simply gathered the bottles and measuring spoons and set them aside in a pantry cabinet no one needed to see every day. The absence changed the kitchen more than any decoration could have. You moved it, Richard said. Rosa looked up from the sink where she was rinsing a mixing bowl. It didn't belong out anymore. He leaned one shoulder against the door frame. You knew before we did. She dried her hand slowly on a dish towel. I knew some things didn't fit together. She did not say, I told you so. She did not need to. Sometimes children's bodies say what their mouths are scared to say. He thought of Annie's sentence from the night before. Getting believed before you're all the way broken. Richard looked toward the back hall where he could hear Evan and Annie upstairs arguing about whether he could beat her at cards if she stopped changing the emotional weather with cheating. The sound was absurdly precious to him. Now you, he said. Rosa studied him a moment. For what part? The question was almost Annie's in its precision for refusing to let us stay foolish longer than we had to. Something softened in Rosa's face, though not fully. Women who had fought for every inch of respect did not dissolve easily into gratitude scenes. Sometimes rich people think their money bought them the whole truth, she said. It usually just buys them a nicer version of being wrong. He exhaled something very close to laughter because the sentence was so mercilessly accurate, it left no room for offense. That afternoon, Evan asked for his homework. Not all of it, just the reading packet and one math sheet that had come in a school email before the investigation formally widened, and his teacher stopped pretending normal instruction was the priority. He sat at the breakfast room table with Annie beside him, and though he groaned at fractions in the way healthy children had every right to, he completed the page. Catherine came in halfway through and stopped in the doorway. Richard, standing beside the sideboard with the mail in his hand, noticed the look that passed over her face. It was not amazement anymore. It was brief meeting relief, the kind only parents knew to realize your child had been reachable all along, but not through the doors you kept using. When Evan finished, Annie tapped the pencil against the page and declared, that's the most healthy anybody's ever looked doing math. He rolled his eyes. Nobody looks healthy doing math. Exactly. He laughed again. By evening, the school had sent formal notice of temporary suspensions pending review for Mercer, Weller, and Hollis. The email was phrased in the same sterile language institutions always used when trying to make moral failure sound procedural. Richard read it once, forwarded it to his attorney, and then closed the laptop. For the first time in months, that night's dinner was not eaten around an absence. Evan sat at the table and asked for more potatoes. Catherine told a story about a charity lunch and gone ridiculous because two old Atlanta women had fought over the same auction item and pretended not to be fighting while doing it. Rosa, though she would ordinarily have eaten later with staff or after getting home, was convinced by Catherine to stay for coffee in the breakfast room once the dishes were cleared. Annie stretched out on the rug with a book, reading upside down because, as she explained, sometimes stories work better if your blood is confused. Richard watched all of it with a kind of cautious awe. This was not triumph. The school investigation was only beginning. The board would protect itself where it could. Other parents would whisper. Lawyers would circle. Damage never yielded all at once. But under his own roof, one fact had become undeniable. The boy who could not be healed by specialists was not, in the deepest sense, sick. He was a child whose fear had been believed too late. And now, as warmth filled the house in ordinary ways, coffee, laughter, small arguments over cards, the clatter of dishes, the scent of clean linens and lemon soap, Richard Whitmore finally understood that what people called a miracle was sometimes nothing more supernatural than this. Remove the danger. Tell the truth. Listen before the breaking goes too far. Then watch how much life returns when a child no longer has to disappear to survive. By Tuesday morning, the Whitmore estate was running on two different kinds of order. The first was the old kind. The kind money built easily. Breakfast laid out at the same hour. Cars arriving on time. Calls routed properly. Dry cleaning returned pressed and wrapped in tissue. The visible machinery of an important household. The second kind was newer, and it had nothing to do with wealth. It was the order that comes when people inside a house stop pretending the wrong things matter most. It showed in smaller ways. Evan coming downstairs without being coaxed. Catherine checking on him without using that hushed, fragile voice mothers sometimes use when fear has replaced ordinary affection. Richard pausing before he spoke as though he were still learning how not to fill every silence with authority. And Rosa moving through the rooms with less apology in her body than when she had first entered them. That morning, she was in the upstairs guest suite sorting fresh linens when Martin Kessler appeared in the doorway. He had been avoiding her for days, avoiding everyone really, though men like Martin preferred to call it maintaining professionalism. Since Richard had ordered payroll corrected, since Catherine had asked hard questions in the foyer, since Annie had turned a rich family's private embarrassment into moral fact, Martin had been moving through the house with the brittle efficiency of someone hoping usefulness might erase guilt. "Rosa," he said, not stepping fully into the room. "Mr. Whitmore would like to see you in his study." She folded the last towel with deliberate care and set it on the bed. "Did he say what for?" Martin's mouth tightened slightly. "No." Annie, who was sitting in the reading chair by the window with a library book open on her lap, looked up immediately. Rosa saw it out of the corner of her eye. Children heard tone before meaning, and Martin's carried enough tension to stir concern. "It's all right, baby," Rosa said. Annie closed the book, but did not rise. "You want me to come?" "No." Martin shifted, perhaps impatient, perhaps uncomfortable. Rosa picked up her cardigan from the chair back, slipped it on, and smoothed the front out of habit. There was a time, not long ago, when being summoned to the study would have made her stomach tighten. In wealthy homes, study doors often opened for workers only when something had gone wrong or was about to be blamed. But too much had changed in too few days for fear to arrive in its old form. As she passed Martin in the doorway, Annie said, "If he tries to thank you too fancy, make him talk plain." Martin blinked. Rosa almost smiled. "I'll manage." Downstairs, the study door was already open. Richard stood near the window in shirt sleeves, his jacket hung over the back of his chair, one hand braced against the walnut desk. Catherine sat in one of the leather armchairs with a folder in her lap. The room looked as it always had: bookshelves, framed awards, old family photographs, but the mood inside it was different from the kind of polished distance the space once held. It felt less like a place where decisions were imposed and more like a room in which something overdue had finally caught up with itself. "Rosa," Catherine said first, "please come in." Rosa stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "You wanted to see me." Richard straightened. For a moment, he looked almost unsure how to begin, and that alone told Rosa this was not ordinary. "Yes." He glanced once at Catherine, then back at Rosa. "I owe you a direct conversation." That phrasing made her cautious. Direct conversations from powerful men often arrived after some private rehearsal, in which they had decided. Honesty should now look noble on them. She remained standing. "All right." Richard did not ask her to sit again, perhaps understanding that invitations to comfort could sound strange when justice was only now being discussed properly. He took a paper from the desk and then, after one look at it, set it back down as if realizing reading from prepared language would be cowardice. "When payroll was delayed," he said, "I told myself it was temporary, that there were pressures in the house, medical costs, shifting priorities, and that the correction would come." He paused. "But the truth is simpler and uglier. I allowed your wages to be treated as flexible because your need was less visible to me than my own." Rosa did not answer. He continued more carefully now. "That was wrong." Still, she said nothing. And the silence forced him to keep going. "You worked. You should have been paid. Not after reminder. Not after embarrassment. Not after my wife had to ask in the foyer. Certainly not after your daughter had to speak for what any decent employer should have handled without prompting." Catherine lowered her eyes briefly. Not in shame for him exactly, but in recognition that some truths did not need a witness interfering with them. Rosa folded her hands loosely in front of her. "You're right." Richard gave one short nod, accepting the lack of softness in her tone. "There's more." That surprised her slightly. He reached again for the paper on the desk, but this time instead of reading, he handed it to her. It was a formal offer of employment, not housekeeper, not cleaner, not something tucked into the back of the household where labor remained invisible until it failed. The title at the top read, "Estate Household Director." Rosa read it once, then again. "We want you to stay," Catherine said quietly, "but not under the old terms and not in the old way." Richard stepped around the desk now, not close enough to crowd her, just enough to make clear that this was not a managerial notice being issued across furniture. "The estate needs someone who actually sees what's happening in it," he said. "The staff trusts you. My son trusts you. Frankly, my wife and I are beginning to understand that we should have trusted your judgment sooner, too." Rosa lowered the paper and looked at him. "You're offering me a promotion?" "Yes. And more money?" "Yes. And authority over household scheduling, payroll oversight, staff coordination, and day-to-day operations." "Yes." A small silence followed. Then Rosa asked the only question that mattered to her. "Why now?" There it was, the necessary knife in the soft fruit of the moment. Why now? Not why the position, not why the raise. Why now after humiliation, after delay, after a child had to demand justice in the foyer? Richard did not insult her with a polished answer. "Because I was wrong about what mattered and who I was overlooking," he said. "And because fixing that partly means changing where respect sits in this house." Rosa held his gaze for a long moment. From outside the study window, pale winter light spread across the lawn. Somewhere down the hall, a maid's cart rolled softly over the hardwood. Life went on around the room as if this were only another administrative conversation. But Rosa knew better. So did they. She set the paper down on the desk. "That title won't mean much if the house still works the same way when nobody's watching." Catherine gave the faintest smile. That sounds like a condition. Rosa looked at her. No, ma'am, it sounds like experience. That almost drew a laugh from Catherine, though not quite. Richard nodded. Then say what you need. Rosa had not expected him to ask so directly, and for one brief second she saw the opening, all women of her kind recognized but were rarely offered. The chance to speak plain before power had time to dress itself again. All right, she said. If I take this, payroll doesn't get moved around because somebody higher up decides there are more urgent problems. Staff don't find out late. They don't get talked to like being paid as a favor. And if a woman in this house works until her feet swell and her back gives out, nobody waits for her child to shame the place before what's owed gets handled. The room was quiet when she finished. Richard answered first. Agreed, Catherine added. And if anyone in this house, staff or family, has a concern about a child being mistreated, it comes straight to me and Richard. No softening, no delay. Rosa looked from one to the other. That too mattered. Not just wages, witness, directness, the thing institutions so often sanded down until it looked polite enough to ignore. Then she did something that surprised even herself. She sat down, not because they had invited her before, and not because the furniture suddenly made her equal, but because she had decided that if she was going to discuss the terms of respect, she would do it seated like any other adult in the room. Catherine noticed. So did Richard. There's one more thing, Rosa said. Richard waited. Annie doesn't become part of the arrangement. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I mean, Rosa said. You don't get to treat her like she belongs to this house now because she helped your son. She's a child. She's not staff. She's not therapy. She's not a small miracle on call whenever the adults feel lost. That landed more deeply than the employment terms had. Richard looked down for a moment, then back at her. You're right, Catherine spoke softly. We care for her. I know you do, Rosa replied. But caring and claiming ain't the same. No one argued with that. The offer remained on the desk between them. No longer a rescue or a favor, but something closer to a renegotiation of truth. At last, Rosa picked it up again. I'll take it, she said. Catherine exhaled the breath she had clearly been holding. Richard nodded once, but there was emotion behind the restraint now, something unpracticed. Thank you. Rosa gave him a direct look. I'm not doing it for gratitude. I know, I'm doing it because houses like this need somebody willing to say what they don't want, said this time. Catherine did laugh softly. A real one. That may be the truest job description in Atlanta. When Rosa left the study, Annie was waiting at the end of the hall exactly where she was not supposed to be. Rosa stopped and put one hand on her hip. You were listening a little. You heard any of it? Annie stood up from the hallway chair enough to know you didn't throw anything at him. Rosa let out a breath that turned into a tired smile. No, baby, I didn't. Annie searched her mother's face. So, what happened? Rosa held up the offer letter. Your Mr. Whitmore finally figured out rich people shouldn't let fools run payroll. Annie nodded solemnly. Took him long enough. That evening, after the papers were signed and Martin had received the new reporting structure with a face so controlled it practically trembled, Richard found Annie in the family room helping Evan build a card tower on the coffee table. She looked up when he entered. My mother says the job is real, she said. It is. And the money, too. Yes. Annie placed another card carefully on the tower. Good. Richard stood there a moment, watching the concentration on both children's faces. Your mother also told me something important today. Annie did not look up. Probably. He almost smiled. She said, you don't belong to this house. Now Annie looked at him. That's right. He nodded. She's right. The answer seemed to satisfy her completely. She turned back to the cards. Then you can still be nice. Is that permission? No, Annie said. That's advice. Evan laughed so hard the card tower fell. And in that ordinary little collapse, with the children laughing in the winter evening, pressing softly at the windows, Richard Whitmore understood something that money had never taught him, and power had never required of him. Repair was not ownership. Gratitude was not absolution, and the people who changed your house did not become part of your possessions simply because they had saved what you loved. 3 months later, spring came early to Georgia, and with it the first real proof that a house could survive the truth and still remain standing. The dogwoods along the Whitmore Drive had begun to bloom, pale white against the deep green of the lawn, and the lower garden, which had looked so cold and watchful in winter, was waking up in soft stages. The roses were budding again. The fountain no longer sounded lonely. Even the air around the estate had changed, warmer now, less brittle, touched with the green scent of things returning. So had Evan. On a bright Saturday morning, Richard stood on the back lawn in shirt sleeves, a baseball in one hand and a glove on the other, watching his son jog toward him over the grass with a look of concentration that used to belong to healthier years. Evan was still thinner than he had been before that long season of fear. He still had moments when he went quiet without warning, moments when some memory from school crossed his face like a cloud over sunlight. Healing, Richard had learned, did not move in a straight line. But the boy was back inside his own life now, and that was no small thing. You ready? Richard asked. Evan adjusted his glove. Don't throw it like you're trying to impress people. Richard almost smiled. I'll try to survive the criticism. From the porch, Catherine laughed softly into her coffee cup. Beside her, Rosa sat in one of the wicker chairs with a clipboard on her lap, reviewing next week's staff schedule with the ease of a woman who had long since stopped apologizing for competence. The new title suited her, though she wore it the same way she wore everything else, with steadiness, not show. The household had changed under her watch. Payroll was punctual, staff turnover had slowed, the kitchen workers laughed more. Even Martin Kessler, now painfully aware that efficiency without decency could be noticed and corrected, had learned to speak to people as though their work actually belonged to them, and sprawled belly down on the porch rug with a book open in front of her. Annie barely glanced up when Richard threw the first ball. Evan caught it cleanly. "There," Richard said. "No showing off." "That one barely counted," Evan replied, already drawing his arm back. The ball came toward Richard with more confidence than force, but he caught it and felt all at once the full weight of how ordinary and miraculous the moment was. Months ago, the boy had been in bed behind drawn curtains, too frightened to tell the truth in a language adults knew how to hear. Now he was outside in spring light, arguing about baseball throws like a child with his whole future still open in front of him. Annie finally looked up from her book. "Y'all are both dramatic for no reason." Evan laughed and threw again. The investigation at Whitmore Academy had not stayed quiet. It was never going to. The review became a scandal exactly as the board had feared, though not in the way they deserved to fear it. Parents talked, teachers talked more. 2 additional families came forward after the formal notices were sent. A 4th boy's name surfaced. Mrs. Dobbobins, when finally interviewed properly, produced a record of emails and meeting notes that proved she had tried to escalate concerns earlier and had been instructed repeatedly to monitor and de-escalate. Headmaster Collins resigned before the end of February. Mercer and Weller had been removed from the school entirely. Hollis's mother, to her credit, withdrew her son voluntarily and put him into counseling before the trustees could dress discipline up his mercy. Richard had been asked twice by reporters for comment and had refused both times, not because he wanted silence anymore, but because he had learned enough to understand that not every wound should be turned into a statement for public consumption. Evan's pain was not a lesson plan for adults with microphones. It was his son's life. When families from the school called to apologize, Richard listened only long enough to tell them that apologies sent after consequence had less moral beauty than people liked to imagine. Catherine, when one mother cried in the middle of a charity luncheon and whispered that no one had realized it was that serious, replied with such chilling grace that the woman later repeated the line to 3 different friends and accidentally made it famous in their social circle. "If you only recognize harm when it embarrasses your class," Catherine had said, then seriousness was never the issue. Rosa said it deserved framing. Annie said rich ladies loved saying sorry after their hair appointments. Evan laughed hard enough to spill orange juice when he heard that, and in some quiet way, that laugh mattered more than any formal vindication the adults ever received. By March, a new arrangement had become possible. Evan would not return to Whitmore Academy. That decision, once unthinkable in their old world, now felt obvious. Instead, he was enrolled in a smaller private school across town with a stronger arts program, no legacy politics to navigate, and a head of school who spoke less about excellence and more about safety, curiosity, and kindness. Richard distrusted such language on first hearing. It sounded too soft, too polished. But then he caught himself and realized softness had not in fact been the enemy. Cowardice had. Evan was not starting until fall. The spring was being left wide open for recovery, tutoring, and the slow restoration of confidence. He was drawing again, sleeping better, eating like a child whose body no longer needed to make fear visible for adults to honor it. Some afternoons he and Annie sat at the breakfast room table doing worksheets and arguing over books. Other afternoons they played cards, walked the lower path, or built ridiculous stories about the turtle in the pond becoming mayor of the estate. Annie, for her part, accepted none of the sentimentality swirling around her. When Catherine once told a friend on the phone that dear child changed everything in this house, Annie, passing through with a glass of lemonade, muttered, "I just said what was already true." Catherine, to her great credit, laughed instead of correcting her. That was perhaps the most surprising change of all. The Whitmore house no longer treated truth like a breach in manners. It still flinched sometimes. It still took the long way around things more than Rosa preferred. Old habits of class and caution died slowly, but they no longer ruled the place. That afternoon, after Richard and Evan had thrown the ball until both of them were warm and a little winded, Evan dropped onto the grass and leaned back on his hands, breathing hard in the clean spring air. Richard sat down across from him, one knee bent, glove resting against his thigh. "You okay?" he asked. Evan gave him a look. "You still ask that like I'm made of glass." Richard absorbed the hit without protest. "I know." For a moment, they sat in companionable quiet while a breeze moved through the trees. Then Evan said, not looking at him, "I like when you ask smaller questions better." Richard let out a breath that turned into a real laugh. "I've been told that before from the porch," Annie called out. "That's because you learn slow." Rosa told her not to holler at grown folks, and Annie replied that some grown folks benefited from public reminders. Even Catherine laughed at that one. Richard looked back toward the porch, then at his son. "She's not wrong." "No," Evan said, "she usually isn't." That too held a kind of healing in it. Children did not return to trust through ceremony. They returned through the ability to joke again, to correct again, to expect listening instead of punishment when they told the truth. Later, When the baseball gloves had been set aside, and Rosa was gathering her papers to head home, Richard found Annie alone by the porch steps, slipping her book into the canvas bag she carried back and forth from the apartment. He stood beside her for a moment before speaking. "There's something I've wanted to ask you." She looked up. "You ask better questions now." "I'm trying." She accepted that with a small nod. "Okay, ask." Richard looked out across the yard where Evan was helping Catherine collect the baseballs from the grass. "Why didn't you let me turn what you did into something bigger than it was?" Annie frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he searched for the cleanest version of the truth. You never acted like saving my son made you belong to us. You never let any of us act like that either." Annie considered him with the same plain seriousness she had brought into the foyer that first day, because helping somebody don't mean they get to have you. The sentence hit him with the same force as all her best ones. Simple, exact, impossible to improve. He nodded slowly. "That's wise. It's just true." "Yes," he said, "it is." Rosa called then that it was time to go. Annie slung the bag over her shoulder and started down the porch steps, then stopped and looked back at him. "You know what though?" she said. "What?" "You did get better." Richard blinked. "At what?" She shrugged. "Listening. And not making everything about being important." He laughed despite himself. "I'll take that as progress." "It is," Annie said. "Just don't mess it up." Then she ran lightly across the path toward her mother, and Richard Whitmore stood on the porch of his own house, watching the two of them walk down toward the side drive where the old Honda waited in the spring sun. Inside, his son was no longer disappearing. Inside, his wife was gentler and fiercer in equal measure. Inside, the people who worked under his roof were being paid on time and spoken to like human beings. Inside, the silence had changed from secrecy to peace. He understood then that the house had not been saved by miracle. Not really. It had been saved by a child who refused to confuse power with truth, by a mother who insisted dignity could not be delayed, and by a boy brave enough at last to stop performing pain and name it. Sometimes justice did not arrive with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it walked in through the front door in worn shoes and asked for wages first. And sometimes healing began the moment someone finally believed the child before the damage became permanent. This story reminds the audience that children often reveal the truth long before adults are willing to face it. Fear does not always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like sickness, silence, obedience, or withdrawal. The story also teaches that justice begins with simple decency, paying people fairly, listening without pride, and caring more about a child's pain than a family's reputation. In the end, the message is clear. Real strength is not power, wealth, or control, but the humility to listen, the courage to admit when you were wrong, and the willingness to protect the vulnerable before the damage becomes permanent. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration.